By 1971, the FDA's Home Preservation Guide had crossed 142 traditional Appalachian cooking methods off its safe practice list. Salt pork barrels in the smokehouse. Wood ash lye in the corn pot. Saltpeter rubbed into a ham hung from a November rafter. Number 73 on this list is the country ham cure that Cornell researchers now study to understand how mountain families went without refrigeration for 6 generations. Number 41 stretched a fall corn harvest through March by soaking the kernels in hardwood ash, the same trick scientists credit with keeping pellagra out of the hollows when it ravaged the cotton belt. Number 8 on this list is the lard and tallow rendering that Crisco's 1911 ad campaign called unhealthy, and that modern lipid research has quietly walked back. They were not breaking the rules, they were following older ones. Now hit subscribe and pull a chair to the wood stove, because here are 100 banned hillbilly cooking tricks that scientists now say were genius. Number 17, making egg gravy over torn biscuit pieces. The pan smelled like a sermon on payday morning. Your grandmother melted a tablespoon of saved drippings into a hot black skillet, stirred in a heaping spoon of flour, and browned it for 2 minutes until the roux turned a deep, toasted color. She poured in equal parts milk and water, whisked it smooth as silk, cracked 1 egg into the simmering pan, and stirred until the white set into ribbons through the sauce, like ribbons of cream through black coffee. She tore the biscuits over each plate with her hands, ladled the hot gravy over the chunks, and the kitchen went quiet for 10 minutes while the children ate. It filled them, warmed your kitchen, and carried a coal miner through 8 hours underground. 1 egg, a spoon of grease, 2 cups of liquid. 5 plates cleared in under 15 minutes flat. Number 20, buttermilk made from clabbered milk and vinegar. Real buttermilk came from the churn after butter was made, and on weeks when Jewel did not churn, she still needed the sour tang for biscuits and cornbread. She poured a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar into a cup of whole milk from her Guernsey cow, stirred once, and set it on the warm edge of the cook stove for 5 minutes. The milk curdled. It smelled like the real thing. The acid cut through the baking soda the same way. Biscuits rose tall. Cornbread rose proud. In 1955, a quart of store-bought buttermilk at the A&P cost 18 cents. A tablespoon of vinegar cost less than a penny. Every mountain woman on Coosa Creek knew this substitution. You can still do it in your own kitchen tonight. Whole milk, apple cider vinegar, 5 minutes. It has worked for 100 years. It will work for you. Number 23, sawmill gravy and biscuits. The name came from the logging camps, where cooks stretched 1 pound of sausage across 40 hungry men by thickening the drippings with flour and milk until the gravy looked like wet cement. In a hillbilly kitchen in 1971, you did the same thing with a 1/4 pound of sausage, 3 tablespoons of flour, and 2 cups of whole milk. The biscuits went in the oven first. By the time they came out golden, the gravy was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. You split the biscuits open, ladled the gravy over the top, and ate it with a fork because a spoon could not keep up. Families in Boone County, West Virginia, made this for breakfast, for dinner, and sometimes for both when the paycheck ran thin. It was powerful fuel for a powerful day. Your grandmother did not call it comfort food. She called it what was on the stove. Number 20, cornbread crumbled in buttermilk. This was the nighttime snack of the mountains. After supper, after the dishes were done, a man would crumble a piece of cold cornbread into a tall glass of buttermilk. He would eat it with a spoon. That was it. No recipe, no name, just cornbread and buttermilk in a glass. The cornbread softened. The buttermilk was tangy and cold. In the coal camps of McDowell County, West Virginia, men ate this every night of their lives. Their fathers had eaten it. Their grandfathers had eaten it. It was not discussed. It was not written down in any cookbook. You poured a glass. You crumbled the bread. You sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of a house, settling into sleep, and you ate something your family had been eating for generations. That mattered. Before there was a smokehouse on the property, and many families never had one, there was the salt box, and it did the same work by different means. After the November butchering, Cuts that couldn't be eaten fresh went into a wooden box packed with dry salt. The rule was absolute. Every surface had to be covered, pressed in by hand to leave nothing exposed. Salt packing drew out the moisture bacteria needed, working slowly until the meat was stable enough to last well into the following summer. A whole ham might need 4 to 6 weeks under salt, smaller slabs of side meat, 2. The salt was often cut with brown sugar and a little saltpeter, a formula passed by watching, never by measuring. In 1930s Appalachia, a 50-pound bag of plain salt cost less than $1 and was one of the most critical purchases made each fall. The salt box required nothing but cold air, the salt, and the knowledge of how thick to pack it. That last part was the hardest thing to hold on to. Sorting laundry by color, whites here, darks there, was a city habit. The women who washed on a board in the 1940s sorted by something more practical: how dirty the clothes actually were. Delicate items and Sunday whites went into the tub first when the water was clean and hot and the soap was at full strength. Then the everyday clothes, the work dresses, the school shirts, then the overalls. Then at the end, when the water had already gone dark gray and the lather was spent, came the barn work. Clothes that had been in mud and engine grease and things nobody named. Running the cleanest clothes through spent water ruined them. Running the dirtiest clothes through fresh water wasted it. In a household where every bucket had to be hauled and every stick of firewood had to be split, that sequence wasn't preference. It was arithmetic. The calculation of a family that couldn't afford to be wasteful with either the water or the mourning. The city sorted by color. The farm sorted by cost. Cornmeal mush was exactly what it sounded like. Cornmeal stirred slowly into boiling water until it thickened into a dense, porridge-like mass. But the real meal came the next morning, when the leftover mush had been poured into a loaf pan and left to set firm in the cold. You sliced it thick, laid the slices in a skillet with hot grease, and fried them until both sides turned golden and crisp, while the center stayed soft and creamy. Cherokee communities had been cooking cornmeal this way long before German-American settlers in the Appalachian foothills adopted the technique, a practice that showed up in household records from Western Virginia and the Carolinas as far back as the 1700s. Topped with sorghum syrup or a drizzle of honey, fried mush was breakfast and supper depending on the household, and the overnight wait was the whole secret. Fresh mush fell apart in the skillet. You had to let the cold do the work. Patience was the ingredient that never made it into the recipe. The garden was not a hobby. It was the difference between eating and not eating. Every house had one: tomatoes, pole beans, squash, sweet corn, potatoes, cucumbers, peppers, laid out in rows that followed the same pattern your grandfather used because he knew which plants grew well beside each other and which ones stole from the soil. The kids weeded. Everybody weeded. You did not complain about it because the alternative was visible from the kitchen window every time the beans started to climb. In summer, the table was nothing but garden food: sliced tomatoes still warm from the vine, corn boiled in the husk, cucumbers soaking in ice water and vinegar. Now raised bed garden kits cost $400, and farm-to-table restaurants charge a premium for produce that traveled fewer miles than your grandfather walked to check on his butter beans. He would not have understood the phrase. The table was 10 steps from the garden. While the wood stove kept things slow, the ice bath did the opposite, and the women who understood both had total control over what came out of their kitchens. Blanching vegetables in boiling water for 60 seconds and then plunging them into a bowl of ice water was the trick that locked in color, snap, and flavor before canning or freezing. The quick boil killed the enzymes that caused vegetables to turn brown and mushy in storage, and the ice bath stopped the cooking dead so nothing went soft. Green beans stayed bright, corn held its sweetness, and okra kept its firmness instead of dissolving into slime. Extension agents from the USDA pushed this hard through the 1940s, printing it in every canning bulletin they mailed to rural households. The women who followed it put up jars that looked as good in February as the day they were packed. Sour milk baking was a technique that transformed what modern families would consider spoiled dairy into the secret ingredient for the fluffiest biscuits and most tender cakes. Before refrigeration, milk clabbered naturally within days, thickening and developing a tangy flavor similar to buttermilk. Rather than viewing this as waste, Grandma embraced clabbered milk as a superior baking ingredient. The natural acids reacted with baking soda to create extra lift, producing biscuits that rose high and light, pancakes that stayed fluffy, and cakes with remarkable tenderness. Children learned to smell milk before pouring. Slightly sour meant perfect for baking. Truly spoiled went to the pigs. Some grandmas intentionally set milk aside in warm spots to encourage clabbering. The practice required understanding the difference between safely soured and dangerously spoiled, knowledge passed through observation and experience. When refrigeration became common, this skill faded, and with it the particular taste that clabbered milk provided. Keeping butter cool in the well was the refrigeration method mountain families relied on before electricity reached rural hollows. A covered crock or bucket containing butter was lowered on a rope into the family well, where water temperature stayed constant around 50 degrees year-round regardless of summer heat above ground. The butter remained firm and fresh for weeks without turning rancid, protected by both the cool temperature and the darkness that prevented light from breaking down the fats. Families designated specific depths for different foods, knowing exactly where to position the rope for optimal cooling. Children were often tasked with lowering and raising the butter crock, learning responsibility through this daily chore. The technique required watertight containers and careful handling to prevent contamination of the drinking water below. This simple system provided what modern refrigerators do today, using nothing but the Earth's natural temperature regulation and a bit of rope. Salt ice cream maker was a summer hack that turned hot afternoons into frozen treat celebrations without requiring expensive equipment or electricity. Families would nest a small metal can inside a larger bucket, filling the space between with crushed ice and rock salt. The salt lowered the freezing point of the ice, creating temperatures cold enough to freeze cream mixture placed in the inner can. Children took turns cranking or shaking the apparatus, watching through patient labor as liquid transformed into creamy dessert. The process took 30 minutes or more of continuous effort, but the anticipation made the rewards sweeter. Homemade ice cream tasted richer than store-bought versions, made with fresh cream, sugar, and whatever flavorings the family had available. Vanilla extract was common, but summer berries or peaches from the orchard made seasonal variations that became family traditions passed down through generations of hot weather gatherings. Making cheese from extra milk turned surplus dairy into preserved protein that stored for months and added richness to meals that plain milk couldn't provide. When cows or goats produced more than families could drink, the excess became farmers' cheese through simple heating, acid addition, and straining. The process required no special equipment beyond cheesecloth and patience, producing fresh cheese within hours of starting. This cheese crumbled over beans, melted into casseroles, spread on bread, and added protein to vegetable dishes. The whey byproduct fed pigs or chickens, meaning nothing from the milk was lost. Families who mastered cheesemaking never worried about milk spoiling before it could be consumed. Some progressed to aged cheeses that stored even longer, creating variety without additional cost. The skill transformed a liability into an asset, proving again that mountain ingenuity could solve problems that money couldn't. Number 20. Frying yesterday's mashed potatoes into supper patties. Frying the leftover mashed potatoes was the simplest second-act supper a hillbilly kitchen ever served. The cold potatoes got scraped out of the icebox bowl, mixed with 1 beaten egg, 2 spoonfuls of flour, salt and black pepper, and a fistful of chopped green onion. The patties were shaped on a wooden board, dredged each side in cornmeal, and laid into a hot greased skillet for 3 minutes per side. The outside went golden brown, and the inside held tender. 3 patties with a slice of cold ham and a spoon of chow chow fed a child to bed full. Number 24. Seasoning cast iron with hog lard. Jules' skillet was 22 years old in 1955. Her husband's mother had given it to her in 1933 as a wedding gift. It had never been washed with soap, and it never would be. Once or twice a year, she rubbed a thin layer of rendered hog lard inside it, set it upside down over the open firebox of the cook stove, and let it bake until the smoke stopped rising. That was the old way, passed down through generations. Every meal built another layer of black on the iron. The surface turned glassy. Nothing stuck, and her skillet was not a pan anymore. It was a record of every meal ever cooked in it. But what most people miss is that a properly seasoned skillet outlasts 3 non-stick pans from the store. Jules' daughter still uses that same skillet today. You can season your own the same way, with the same hog lard. A powerful tool, passed down without a receipt. Number 18. Fried apples. When the apple tree behind the house dropped its fruit in September, a hillbilly mother in Letcher County, Kentucky, carried a bushel basket to the porch and kept one handful at a time in her apron pocket. She sliced the apples into a skillet with a spoonful of bacon grease, a handful of brown sugar, and a shake of cinnamon. 10 minutes. That was it. The apples softened, caramelized, and turned the color of a wood stove at dusk. You ate them beside a slab of country ham or spooned them over hot biscuits. The apples cost nothing. The sugar was 18 cents a pound. One skillet fed a whole family. Your grandmother ate fried apples the way a New York banker ate dessert, and she did not need anyone to call it special. She called it Tuesday. Number 18. Pawpaw fruit. Every September, in the shaded creek bottoms across Appalachia, the pawpaw trees dropped their fruit. Children knew exactly where the trees were. They guarded those locations the way other children guarded a fishing hole. The fruit was roughly the size of a mango, with a thin green skin that bruised easily. Inside, the flesh was yellow and custard soft, with a flavor somewhere between banana and mango. You ate it raw, standing under the tree, spitting out the large brown seeds. There was no way to store a pawpaw. It ripened for about a week and then it was gone. That narrow window made it precious. In Mingo County, West Virginia, families planned their September around pawpaw season. Grandmothers made pawpaw bread. Children ate them until their stomachs ached. And then the season ended. The pawpaw was never cultivated commercially because it could not survive shipping. Too soft, too fragile, too brief. The only people who ever tasted it were the people who lived near the trees. In the hollows along the Tug Fork River, a man named Dewey Blankenship kept a pawpaw grove on his property that his grandfather had tended before him. Every September, neighbors walked to his land with paper sacks, and he let them pick without charge. He never sold a single fruit. He said it was not his to sell. The trees were there before his family arrived, and they would be there after he was gone. Your children will probably never taste a pawpaw. That is not because the trees disappeared. It is because nobody walks to them anymore. Soup beans were started before anyone else was awake. The pintos had soaked overnight, and by the time the kitchen was light enough to see, she had a piece of fatback already browning in the bottom of the pot. Water in to cover, lid on low, and the beans cooked all morning without anyone being asked to watch. She knew by the smell when they were getting close. Soup beans were Monday food in most Appalachian households. The anchor of the week, something you could eat twice in a day without complaint because the pot just got better as the hours went on. By the 1950s, pinto beans ran around 14 cents a pound at the company store, and a pound could feed a family of 6 if the cornbread was thick. The beans went into the bowl, and the cornbread went in beside them. You used the bread to push the beans onto the spoon because that was the right way, and everyone knew it without being told. The variations were as personal as handwriting, and hers was the only one that tasted right. What the third tub held was an optical illusion. Laundry bluing had been in American homes since before the Civil War, and Mrs. Stewart's concentrated liquid bluing, first sold in Minneapolis on July 30, 1883, was still on laundry shelves a century later because it worked in a way nothing else replicated. White fabric yellows with age and washing. The bluing countered that shift not by removing the yellow, but by adding the faintest trace of blue, so faint the eye read the combination as brilliant white. A typical Appalachian wash setup kept a separate bluing tub as the final rinse, The water tinted that thin, clear sky blue that meant whites were finished. Too much bluing turned the sheets faintly lavender, and you heard about it. The right amount was a few drops in a full tub of cold water, barely visible, just present. She held the bottle up to the light before she poured. Every April, the hillsides across West Virginia and western North Carolina pushed up clusters of Allium tricoccum, wild ramps, and the people who knew where to find them never told anyone else. Ramp patches were family secrets handed down like property lines, and poaching from someone else's patch could start a feud that lasted a generation. You dug them with a short knife, pulling the whole plant, white bulb, red stem, broad green leaves, and brought them home smelling like garlic and wet earth. The quickest supper was a ramp and egg scramble. You chopped the ramps rough, fried them in butter or bacon grease until they softened, cracked 2 eggs over them, and stirred everything together in the skillet. The flavor was sharp and wild, nothing like the tame onions from a grocery store. Mountain communities held ramp suppers every spring, church halls packed with families eating ramps fried, boiled, and raw, and the smell hung on your clothes for days. The old-timers called them a spring tonic, medicine as much as food. If ramps tasted like the wild mountainside, this next one tasted like the bare kitchen counter at the end of the month when the paycheck was gone and the pantry held almost nothing. She kept it in a crock on the counter, fed it flour and water every morning like a living thing. Because it was. That sourdough starter had been in the family longer than the farmhouse. Her mother gave it to her the day she married, wrapped in a cloth inside a jar, and her mother's mother had done the same before that. The bread it made was dense and sour and nothing like what came from a store, and if you forgot to feed it, if you let it go cold too long, you lost something that could not be replaced by starting over. When the pandemic hit and every person in America suddenly wanted to bake sourdough, Appalachian women shook their heads. They had never stopped. The starters they tended were not a trend. They were an inheritance. You can buy a dehydrated starter online now for $15, but it will not carry the taste of a kitchen where the same hands fed the same culture for 50 years without missing a morning. The testing oil temperature with a pinch of flour was how every country cook knew the skillet was ready for frying, decades before anyone owned a kitchen thermometer. You dropped a small pinch into the hot grease and watched. If it sank and sat, the oil was too cold. If it sizzled gently and browned slow, you were close. If it hit the surface and immediately danced and popped and turned golden in seconds, the grease was right for chicken, fish, or fritters. Too much smoke meant you had gone too far and needed to pull the pan off the heat. Some cooks used a cube of bread instead. If it browned in 60 seconds, the oil was at around 365 degrees. The knowledge lived in the hands of women who stood over those skillets every evening. And when they stopped cooking, the next generation reached for a thermometer because nobody had taught them what the flour was for. Cast iron seasoning was sacred knowledge passed from mother to daughter, determining whether a woman could properly keep house and feed her family. Grandma's skillets had been seasoned for decades, their surfaces black and glossy from countless layers of lard rubbed in and baked on until naturally non-stick. New brides received cast iron as wedding gifts along with strict instructions. Never use soap, never let water sit, always wipe with grease after washing. The seasoning process was ritualistic. Coat the pan with lard, bake it upside down for hours, let it cool completely, repeat until the surface gleamed. A properly seasoned skillet could fry eggs that slid like they were on ice, could sear cornbread with a perfect crust, could last through generations of daily use. Some families had skillets tracing back to great-grandmothers, the accumulated seasoning containing decades of family meals. Losing that seasoning through careless cleaning was considered a tragedy. Storing eggs in water glass was the preservation method that kept mountain families supplied through winter months when hens stopped laying entirely and eggs became scarce. Water glass, a solution of sodium silicate and water, sealed eggshells by filling their tiny pores and preventing air and bacteria from entering. Fresh eggs were carefully lowered into crocks filled with the solution, where they remained edible for 6 months or longer without refrigeration. Families gathered eggs during peak laying season and preserved dozens at a time, ensuring protein through lean months. The technique required clean eggs with intact shells, so women handled each one carefully, rejecting any with cracks that might introduce contamination. Eggs preserved this way cooked normally, though they sometimes produced flatter whites, which mattered little when food security was the priority. The crocks were stored in cool cellars where temperatures stayed stable. Bacon grease lamp was an emergency lighting solution that turned kitchen waste into functional illumination when kerosene ran low or power lines failed. Families saved rendered bacon fat in metal cans, knowing it could serve double duty beyond cooking. The process involved pouring the solidified grease into a shallow dish, then inserting a twisted cotton rag or piece of string as a wick. Once lit, the grease burned slowly with a steady yellow flame that could illuminate a room for hours. The light wasn't bright, but it was enough for evening chores, reading, or navigating dark hallways during storms. The smell was distinctive, a smoky bacon aroma that filled the house, but families considered it preferable to sitting in darkness. This hack represented the mountain philosophy that nothing should be wasted when it could serve another purpose. Many households kept a dedicated bacon grease lamp ready throughout winter months when storms frequently knocked out electricity. Cooking dried beans from scratch instead of buying canned versions saved enormous money while producing superior results that no factory processing could match. A pound of dried beans costing under $1 produced the equivalent of 4 or 5 cans, which would cost several dollars at store prices. The beans required soaking and longer cooking times, but rewarded patience with creamier texture and better flavor absorption. Families cooked large batches on weekends, portioning for meals throughout the week or freezing for later use. The cooking liquid itself became flavorful broth for soups and gravies, meaning dried beans produced more usable food than their canned equivalents. Children who grew up eating properly cooked dried beans often found canned versions disappointing by comparison. This single substitution could save families hundreds of dollars annually while actually improving meal quality, the rare budget trick that sacrificed nothing. Number 13, foraging poke salad in spring before the cellar ran dry. Spring came up the hollers in late March, and the first thing it sent through the leaves was the bright purple sprout of a pokeweed. Every coal camp grandmother in eastern Kentucky watched the road banks for it. She picked the young leaves before the plant was 8 inches tall, carried them home in her apron, and rinsed them 3 full times. The boil was the part that mattered most. She dropped the leaves into salted water for 15 minutes, drained the dark liquid, and boiled them again in fresh water. Only then was the poke safe to eat. Her mother taught her the 2-boil rule standing in that same kitchen 40 years before. She fried the cooked greens in bacon grease, stirred a beaten egg through, then served them with cornbread on 1,000 Appalachian tables in that same March week. The greens were free for the picking, the grease was saved from breakfast. The egg came from the henhouse out back. The cellar shelves had thinned to 2 jars of pickled corn and a few strings of dried apples by the last week of March, and the first poke greens off the road bank were the first fresh green thing on a plate in 5 months. Number 17, drying apples on a window screen in the sun. The apples came off the 2 old Arkansas black trees behind Jewel's barn the 3rd week of September 1955, about 6 bushels between them. She peeled and cored and sliced them into 8 wedges each. She laid the wedges on 2 old window screens set up on sawhorses out on the front porch. The screens let the air move around every slice. A piece of cheesecloth on top kept the flies off. She turned the slices once a day for 5 days. By the 6th day, they were brown, leathery, and shrunk to 1/3 of the original weight. She tied them up in clean cotton flour sacks and hung them from the ceiling beams of the cabin. Through winter, those dried apples became stack cakes, fried pies, and sweetness in a pot of sweet potatoes. No jar, no sugar, no heat, no power. Just the sun. A bag of store-bought dried apples at the A&P cost 34 cents in 1955. Jewel spent 0. That is the whole argument for a screen on a sawhorse. Number 14, fried fatback. This is the cheapest meat a Hillbilly family ever ate. A pound of fatback, which is pure pork fat with a strip of salt-cured rind, cost 22 cents in 1973. You sliced it thin, laid the strips in a cold cast-iron skillet, and let them render slow over low heat. 10 minutes later, the fat was gone into the pan and the strips were curled, crisp and salty enough to season an entire plate of beans. Families in Mingo and Logan counties ate fried fatback beside a wedge of cornbread and a glass of buttermilk. The leftover grease in the skillet became the cooking fat for the next 3 meals. A quarter pound of fatback could flavor a whole week of soup beans. Here is the thing that surprised me when I first read the oral histories. The speed of these recipes was not an accident. It was survival logistics. In the Mingo and Logan County mines in 1972, shift change at Williamson and Island Creek happened at 4:15 in the afternoon. A man had 35 minutes to walk home, wash off the coal dust at the back porch sink, sit down at the table, and eat enough calories to sleep through until the 5 in the morning whistle. If the food was not hot, on the table, and calorie-dense inside that window, he ate cold, he slept hungry, or the children got less so that the miner got more. That is why every one of these recipes runs under 25 minutes. That is why the skillet stayed on the back burner all afternoon. That is why the biscuits went in at 3:45 sharp. The women in these kitchens were not slow cooks romanticizing a rustic life. They were shift workers running a household on a mine whistle. A wife in Logan County, West Virginia, timed her entire day against a steam whistle a mile and a half away. A second shift meant a second supper at midnight. A third shift meant breakfast at 4 in the morning. The recipes were quick because the husband's life, the children's homework, the second job the oldest daughter worked at Kroger, and the sleep every one of them needed depended on a 20-minute window that closed hard. That is the part most food writers miss. Number 22, cracklin' bread. Every fall, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the hog killing started, the women saved the cracklings. Cracklings were the crispy, golden pieces of pork skin and fat left over after the lard was rendered. You could eat them straight, and people did. The real prize, though, was cracklin' bread. Cornmeal, buttermilk, a pinch of salt, and a handful of those cracklings baked in a cast-iron skillet greased with lard. The bread came out dense and golden, with pockets of crispy pork through every bite. Children ate it after school. Men carried a wrapped piece in their coat pocket to the field. It did not need butter. The cracklings had already given it all the salt and fat a person could want. In the mountains of West Virginia, families waited all year for hog killing day, and the cracklin' bread was the first reward. The ones who did not know the preparation could have killed themselves. Pokeweed, the tall-stalked plant with dark purple berries that grew wild along Appalachian roadsides, contained phytolactotoxin through every part of its structure. Eating it raw or undercooked caused vomiting, convulsions, and in documented cases, death. But the people who knew understood that young spring leaves, harvested when the plant was still under a foot high, could be made safe through a preparation that could not be shortened. You brought a pot to a full rolling boil, added the leaves, cooked 15 minutes, and drained every drop. Fresh water, back to the boil, cook again, drain again. Fresh water a third time, cook, drain. Only after 3 full cycles did the greens go into the skillet with bacon grease and onion, with scrambled egg folded in at the end. Salad was the Old English word for cooked greens, carried into Appalachian speech by early settlers. The dish was celebrated each June at the Polk Salad Festival in Harlan, Kentucky. You could only earn it by knowing what nobody had written down. Saturday afternoons, she made the starch. Not from a can, from a cup of wheat flour stirred into cold water until smooth, then drizzled slowly into a pot of boiling water and stirred until it thickened to the consistency of thin gravy. It cost nothing because flour was already in the kitchen, and it worked on cotton collars and church blouses as well as anything that ever came in commercial packaging. The trick was concentration. Too thick, and the iron dragged and scorched. Too thin, and the collar wilted before noon. She knew it by how the liquid fell off the spoon. The garment was dipped, wrung out gently, hung to dry part way. then ironed while still slightly damp, the only way the starch set properly and held through a full day. Appalachian women had been making wheat starch this way since before the Civil War, and the practice held in mountain households well into the 1960s, where commercial spray starch wasn't worth the expense. What the store eventually sold in a blue aerosol can, she made in a pot in 20 minutes. Sawmill gravy got its name in the lumber camps of the late 1800s, where cooks fed crews of men using nothing but flour, grease, milk, and black pepper in quantities large enough to fill a washtub. The gravy was thick, pale, peppery, and poured over anything that held still: biscuits, toast, cornbread, fried potatoes. You started with a few spoonfuls of bacon drippings in a hot skillet, stirred in flour until it turned golden and smelled like toasted grain, then poured in milk slowly while scraping the bottom of the pan. The whole process took less than 10 minutes and fed a household for pennies. Some cooks called it bulldog gravy, and in the coal camps of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, it showed up at every meal: breakfast, dinner, and supper, because the mines paid low and the company store charged high. The pepper had to bite. If you couldn't feel the pepper, the gravy wasn't finished. She made it by sound. The sizzle of flour hitting grease told her everything a recipe never could. Rocks were already working. Sauerkraut packed in salt and pressed under a stone. Cucumber pickles brined in vinegar and dill with a grape leaf dropped in to keep them crisp. Chow chow relish made from the last green tomatoes before the first frost, chopped with cabbage and onion and peppers, and sealed in jars that glowed yellow and green on the cellar shelf. Fermentation was not a food trend. It was the only way to make vegetables last from October to April when you had no freezer, and the nearest grocery was 20 miles of bad road. The German and Scots-Irish settlers who came into the Appalachian valleys brought these techniques with them in the 1700s, and they passed them down so consistently that families in West Virginia were still using the same crocks and the same brine ratios 2 centuries later. Kombucha alone is now a $3 billion industry. The crocks that started it all are in antique shops. Making buttermilk from scratch with a splash of vinegar and regular milk was one of the oldest substitutions in country baking, and it worked because the acid did exactly what real buttermilk does. It reacted with baking soda to produce the carbon dioxide that made biscuits rise and pancakes turn fluffy. 1 tablespoon of white vinegar stirred into a cup of whole milk, left to sit for 5 minutes until it thickened and curdled slightly, gave you something close enough that no one at the table could tell the difference. Before the 1920s, real buttermilk was the liquid left over from churning cream into butter, and every household that kept a cow had plenty. When families stopped churning, this trick kept the old recipes alive. You poured until the milk looked right, added the vinegar by feel, and moved on. It was just what you did when the recipe called for something you did not have and the nearest store was 20 miles of dirt road away. Smokehouse operation was crucial knowledge for preserving the hogs and wild game that provided protein through winter months. Every farm had a smokehouse, a small wooden building where meat hung in fragrant clouds of hickory, apple, or oak smoke for weeks at a time. After butchering and salt curing, hams, bacon slabs, and sausages were suspended from hooks high above smoldering fires that never quite flamed. The smoke deposited preservative compounds onto the meat while slowly drying it, creating an environment hostile to bacteria and insects. Grandma monitored the smokehouse daily, adjusting ventilation and adding wood to maintain consistent temperatures and smoke density. The process could take 3 weeks or longer for large hams, requiring patience and vigilance. Properly smoked meat could hang in cool pantries for a year without spoiling, providing precious protein when fresh meat was unavailable. The rich, smoky flavor became so associated with mountain cooking that store-bought meat seemed bland by comparison. Wrapping food in wet newspaper before burying it in coals was a technique that created steam cooking without any equipment at all beyond what most families had available. The dampened paper protected food from direct contact with ash, while moisture trapped inside created pressure that cooked fish and vegetables evenly throughout. Mountain families learned this from Native American traditions, and adapted it to their own needs, using whatever paper was available from rare newspapers to catalog pages. The paper charred on the outside while food inside steamed to perfection, emerging clean and thoroughly cooked. Timing was crucial because too long meant paper burned through while too short left food underdone. Experienced cooks developed instinct for judging coals and thickness. The technique worked especially well for delicate fish that fell apart when fried, keeping flesh intact while infusing subtle smoke flavor. Children watched this magic happen at fish fries. Potato rust remover was a surprisingly effective tool for restoring rusted cast iron, knife blades, and metal implements to working condition. The technique involved cutting a raw potato in half, dipping the cut surface into dish soap or salt, then using it to scrub rusted metal surfaces. The oxalic acid naturally present in potatoes reacted with iron oxide, loosening rust and allowing it to be wiped away easily. Families discovered this hack when polishing their precious cast iron skillets, the cornerstones of mountain cooking that needed regular maintenance to stay functional. The potato provided gentle abrasion without scratching seasoned surfaces, making it safer than steel wool or harsh chemicals that could damage the pan's coating. Children were often assigned this task, working through collections of rusty tools and kitchen implements on Saturday mornings. The method was slow but effective, requiring patience as the potato gradually broke down rust layer by layer. Foraging wild greens in spring provided free vegetables packed with vitamins that mountain families needed after long winters, surviving on stored food and preserved meats. Women and children walked fields and forest edges gathering dandelion greens, poke salad, lamb's quarters, and wild onions that grew abundantly without any cultivation or cost. These greens required knowledge to identify safely, but that knowledge passed through generations until gathering became instinctive. Properly prepared, wild greens tasted as good or better than store-bought vegetables, with deeper mineral complexity from growing in rich forest soil. Some families gathered enough to can or dry for later, extending free food into seasons when nothing grew. The practice connected people to land in ways grocery shopping never could, teaching children that food existed everywhere if you knew how to find it. Spring foraging trips became family traditions, mixing nutrition gathering with outdoor time and generational knowledge transfer. Number 15. Canning 365 jars of green beans every summer. The smell of vinegar and steam in an Appalachian kitchen in August was the smell of survival being put up by the quart. Your great-grandmother stood in a hot kitchen for 10 days every summer, snapping beans on the porch by morning, blanching them in a black canner by 10, packing ball jars by noon, and lowering them into a boiling water bath that ran until dark. 365 jars, one a day for the year. The math was the year. The part most people forget is that the jars were not extra. They were the budget. She used a pressure cooker she had bought in 1949 for $11, jars she washed every season, and lids she bought for 49 cents at the IGA. Her husband cut the wood that fired the stove. Her oldest daughter washed jars in scalding water. Her youngest carried the canner to the porch. Every jar she sealed was a winter night that would have a vegetable on the plate. The seller held them by row, by date, by category, and a handwritten ledger pinned to the door tracked what came in and what went out. By April, the rows were empty and the gardens were going back in. The ledger was your family budget for the cold months, written in jars instead of dollars. Today, a can of green beans at the grocery costs you around $1.50, while a home-canned quart runs about 30 cents to put up. 300 jars is $450 in winter food your family does not have to buy. Every Appalachian woman who stood in that hot kitchen knew the arithmetic of August. Real quick before number 14, if any of these tricks remind you of your grandmother's kitchen, I put together a recipe guide with more dishes built the same way. The cornbread, the soup beans, the dried apples, the milk gravy. The link is right below this video. Number 18. Salt-rising bread leavened by wild microbes. This was the loaf that nobody else in Jules Holler could make anymore. She kept a starter going from her grandmother's time, a mash of cornmeal, warm milk, and a pinch of salt, left overnight in a crock wrapped in a wool blanket behind the cook stove. By morning, it smelled sharp, like very ripe cheese, and it hissed faintly when she opened it. That smell meant the wild bacteria, Clostridium perfringens, was alive and working. She did not know the Latin name of the microbe. She knew the crock had to stay at blood temperature, about 104 degrees, for 16 hours or the starter would die. Salt-rising bread has no yeast. It is leavened by hydrogen gas from a wild bacterium found in flour itself, and the technique was invented by pioneer women in these mountains in the 1770s, before yeast was sold in packets at the store. The earliest recorded recipe dates to 1778 in what is now West Virginia. The loaf is dense, white, almost cheesy. Jewel baked 2 a week and traded one to the neighbor who kept her in sorghum. What most people miss is that every woman on Coosa Creek who knew this starter learned it from a woman, back to the Scots-Irish women who carried wheat flour over the Blue Ridge and had no yeast at all. That tradition almost died with Jewel's generation. If your great-grandmother was Appalachian, she likely knew the smell. You can still start one tonight with cornmeal and a warm place to hide it. Number 20. Wilted lettuce with bacon grease. In the spring, when the leaf lettuce in the garden was tender and the coal camp commissary had not yet stocked the tomatoes, a hillbilly woman would tear a bowl of lettuce, slice a green onion over it, and pour hot bacon grease straight from the skillet across the top. The lettuce collapsed in 3 seconds. A splash of apple cider vinegar went in next, then a crack of black pepper. You ate it while it was still warm. That was it. Women in Pike County, Kentucky, served this beside a pot of soup beans and a wedge of cornbread. It took 90 seconds to make. The lettuce came from a garden that cost nothing. The bacon grease came from the tin by the stove. It was the first green thing the family had tasted in 4 months, and it tasted like a promise that the hard part of winter was over. Number 19. Leather breeches. This was not a snack in the way a modern person thinks of a snack. But in the early 1960s, mountain families pulled leather breeches off the string hanging from the porch ceiling and chewed on them the way a person today might chew on beef jerky. Leather breeches were green beans, threaded onto a long piece of string with a needle, then hung to air dry for weeks. The beans shriveled and turned brown and leathery. The name came from the way they looked, like tiny pairs of leather pants on a clothesline. The practice likely came from the Cherokee, though German settlers in the Palatinate had a similar tradition. By the 1960s, they were a winter staple in the mountains of North Carolina, Virginia, and Kentucky. When you were hungry between meals, you pulled a few off the string and chewed. They were tough and earthy and tasted like summer gone quiet. Most families kept several strings drying at once, each one holding enough beans to last a month. That was the whole point of them, not flavor, survival. The knowledge that when the snow came and the garden was dead and the nearest store was 12 miles of frozen road away, there was still food hanging from the ceiling. In Watauga County, North Carolina, a woman named Ora Mae Ward strung leather breeches on her front porch every August for 40 years. Her grandchildren would sit on the steps and help thread the beans, and she would tell them stories about the winters when the only vegetables came from that string. Those strings are gone from most porches now. The skill went with them. The grandchildren who sat on those steps are grandparents themselves now, and most of them have never threaded a single bean. But the taste, for anyone who remembers it, never left. It never will. Pot liquor was the liquid left in the pot after a long cook of greens with pork. Dark, glossy, smelling of collards and ham and something mineral underneath. In mountain households, it was not a byproduct to discard, but a dish in its own right, poured into a tin cup and drunk while the greens were being plated, or used to soak the cornbread so it could carry more flavor to the mouth per bite. The mineral content was genuinely high. A long cook drew calcium, iron, and B vitamins from the greens that would otherwise be lost. And mountain people understood this without nutritional vocabulary, but with hard practical knowledge passed across generations. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt entered a public debate about whether pot liquor should be drunk as broth or sopped with cornbread. A moment that tells you something about how seriously this liquid was regarded. The ones who knew it best always drank it straight from the cup first, still hot enough to steam. When she left the kitchen for the last time, that cup went cold, and nobody thought to fill it. You used the wrong tub once, just once. That was how you learned. The 3-tub system that governed Hillbilly Wash Day was not complicated, but it was absolute. The first tub held hot soapy water for washing. The second held clean, warm water for rinsing the soap out. And the third, kept separate, always to the right, filled last, held the bluing water. Getting the order wrong meant hauling fresh water all over again, wasting a morning's fire, and hearing about it until supper. The wash moved through those tubs in one direction only, dirty to clean to white. The soap tub went gray within an hour. The rinse tub went milky. The bluing tub stayed that thin sky blue all morning, the color so faint you almost thought you'd imagined it. Women who grew up with this system couldn't understand, later, how a single machine with one drum was supposed to do what 3 separate tubs accomplished in careful sequence. The logic wasn't nostalgia. It was chemistry. When the nearest ocean was 500 miles away and fresh fish meant a creek full of catfish you didn't have time to catch, canned salmon was the answer. Salmon patties, canned salmon mixed with egg, cracker crumbs, and chopped onion, shaped into rounds and fried in a skillet, showed up on Friday supper tables across Appalachia and the rural South every week for decades. During the 1930s and 40s, a can of pink salmon cost less than 15 cents and provided enough protein to stretch across 2 meals for a family of 4. Coal mining families in West Virginia and eastern Kentucky relied on them because the company store stocked canned goods but rarely fresh meat. The patties fried best in a well-seasoned cast-iron skillet with enough grease to come halfway up the sides, and you pressed them thin so the edges went crisp while the center stayed moist. The smell of canned salmon frying on a Friday evening was so specific to these kitchens that catching a trace of it decades later could stop you cold in a grocery aisle. Nothing was thrown away. Not the tongue, not the feet, not the brains, not the intestines. When a hog was butchered in Appalachia, every part of that animal had a destination. The head went into souse meat, the organs into liver mush or scrapple, the intestines were cleaned and stuffed for sausage casings or boiled into chitterlings, and the blood became blood pudding. Even the bladder got saved. Children blew it up like a balloon. The fat rendered to lard, the bones simmered into broth, the skin fried into cracklings. Waste was not a moral position. It was math. A family that threw away the feet of a hog was a family that did not understand how close they were to going hungry. Michelin-starred restaurants now charge $40 for roasted bone marrow on toast and call it nose-to-tail dining, a philosophy that poor families practiced without ever giving it a name. Before anyone owned a set of mixing bowls big enough to dredge a whole chicken, the paper bag was the tool, and it worked better than anything that replaced it. Shaking chicken in a brown paper bag of seasoned flour was how Sunday dinner got its coating in kitchens from West Virginia to East Tennessee, and the method was fast even, and left almost no mess to clean up. You dumped a cup of flour, salt, black pepper, and maybe a pinch of paprika into the bag, dropped in 2 or 3 pieces at a time, folded the top shut, and shook hard until every surface was covered. The enclosed space created a cloud of flour inside the bag that reached every fold and crevice the way a shallow plate of flour never could. Kids fought over who got to do the shaking, and the sound of that bag rustling against the counter meant chicken was coming and everybody needed to wash their hands. The bags went into the trash and the chicken went into the grease, and that was Sunday. Pressure canning summer vegetables was the difference between eating well through winter and going hungry when snow covered mountain gardens. Grandma spent late summer surrounded by mason jars, boiling kettles, and bushels of tomatoes, green beans, corn, and whatever else the garden produced. The pressure canner hissed on the wood stove while children helped wash vegetables and pack jars, learning skills they would carry into their own households. Each sealed jar represented security, food that would last through lean months when nothing fresh grew and money for store-bought goods didn't exist. Root cellars filled with rows of jewel-toned jars, ruby tomatoes, golden corn, emerald green beans, purple beets. The work was exhausting and hot, lasting from dawn until dark for weeks. But when January winds howled and snow drifted against cabin walls, families opened those jars and tasted summer. Every bite reminded them that hard work during plenty created comfort during scarcity. Using buttermilk to soak tough cuts was the tenderizing secret that transformed stringy wild game and older livestock into something approaching store-bought quality. The acid in buttermilk broke down tough muscle fibers, while the milk fats kept meat moist during cooking. Cuts were submerged in buttermilk overnight or longer, with the liquid penetrating deep into the flesh and neutralizing strong gamey flavors. Buttermilk was always available in households that kept dairy cows, making it a free tenderizer that cost nothing beyond the soaking time. The technique worked especially well on squirrel, rabbit, and venison that would otherwise require hours of stewing to become chewable. After soaking, meat was drained and cooked normally, emerging tender and mild enough for even picky children. This knowledge passed between generations as essential cooking wisdom that made the difference between enjoyable meals and tough, unpleasant chewing. Cornmeal ant barrier was a pest control method that protected pantries and kitchens without toxic chemicals or expensive exterminators. Families discovered that sprinkling dry cornmeal along windowsills, doorways, and cabinet edges created a line that ants wouldn't cross. The theory held that ants would carry cornmeal back to their colonies where it would expand inside their digestive systems, eliminating the problem at its source. Whether scientifically accurate or not, the method worked well enough that families passed it down through generations. The cornmeal was cheap, safe around children and pets, and didn't require any special application beyond sprinkling it where ants appeared. Some families mixed the cornmeal with sugar to make it more attractive to foraging ants, increasing its effectiveness as bait. This hack remained popular precisely because it used an ingredient every mountain kitchen already stocked, turning pantry staples into practical pest solutions. Bartering surplus garden produce with neighbors multiplied food variety without spending any money and strengthened community bonds that provided security beyond economics. A family with excess tomatoes could trade with neighbors growing surplus squash, both ending up with more variety than either could produce alone. These informal exchange networks operated on trust and reciprocity, with families tracking favors across seasons and years. The practice encouraged specialization, with some families focusing on crops they grew best, knowing they could trade for what they lacked. Children learned negotiation and fairness through watching these exchanges, understanding that community relationships held real economic value. Bartering extended beyond produce to include eggs, preserved goods, skills, and labor, creating resilient networks that survived when cash economies struggled. The practice meant grocery stores became supplementary rather than essential, with most food coming from gardens and neighbors. Number 21. Stretching whole milk with water and powdered milk. The smell of cold milk mixing with warm carnation powder filled every coal camp kitchen the night before payday. A box of Carnation Instant Non-Fat Dry Milk from the IGA cost 95 cents and made 8 quarts, while a gallon of fresh pet whole milk at the company store ran 75 cents. Your grandmother poured the fresh milk into a pitcher, added cold water and a half cup of dry powder, stirred it with a long-handled spoon, and slid the pitcher into the icebox overnight. By morning, the children could not tell the difference, and that was the whole reason of the trick. The cereal still got cold milk. The biscuits still got buttermilk poured the way they always had. The gravy still set up the same. Today, a gallon of whole milk costs around $4, and the math still cuts your milk bill in half. It was not a secret because anyone hid it. It was a secret because the children were not supposed to find out. Number 21. Sorghum instead of white sugar. Jewel had not bought white sugar since 1951. The farm up the ridge grew sweet sorghum cane, and every October a neighbor ran the cane through a mule-drawn press, then boiled the juice down in a long copper pan over a wood fire for 8 hours. What came out was a dark, earthy syrup with a taste of malt and iron. She traded 4 dozen eggs for a 1-gallon jar, which amounted to about $1.60 in 1955 trade value. That jar sweetened her coffee, cornbread, apple butter, sweet potato pie, and the medicine she gave the children when they coughed. Here is what most people miss. Sorghum has more calcium, more iron, and more potassium than sugar. Jewel did not know the chemistry. She knew the jar lasted 3 months and cost her nothing but eggs. Your grandmother likely had one too, back in the pantry, going dark and sticky. And that was the working rhythm of a hillbilly kitchen. Number 16. Cat head biscuits. These were called cat head biscuits because they were the size of a cat's head, big and soft and pulled apart with 2 hands. In a coal camp kitchen in McDowell County, West Virginia, a woman named Mavis Blevins made 6 of them every morning before 5 when her husband left for the Pocahontas mine. 2 cups of self-rising flour, 1/3 of a cup of lard, 3/4 of a cup of buttermilk. She patted the dough out on a board dusted with flour, pinched off 6 equal chunks, pressed them flat with her palm, and slid them into a hot oven. 15 minutes later, they came out tall, golden, and shaped by a woman's hand instead of a biscuit cutter. Her husband took 2 in his lunch bucket every day for 19 years. She never once missed a morning. Now here is the part that most people miss about a coal camp kitchen. These biscuits were never only about breakfast. They were how a working wife told her working husband that she was still there, still awake at 4:30, still paying attention, even when the wage slip from the mine was thin and the company store ledger was thick. In Mingo, Logan, and McDowell counties, a cat head biscuit was a love letter baked in a skillet. The flour was 39 cents for a 5-pound sack. The lard was $4 for a 3-pound tub that lasted 6 weeks. The buttermilk was 29 cents a quart. A breakfast that cost less than a dime said something no greeting card could say. And that is why, when the children grew up and moved to Columbus or Cincinnati for the auto plant jobs, the first thing they asked their mothers to mail them was a cat head biscuit wrapped in wax paper and cold by the time it arrived. Number 25. Pickled eggs. Cecil Fugate was not the only man in eastern Kentucky selling them. Every country store, every gas station from Harlan to Hazard had a jar on the counter. Hard-boiled eggs, peeled and dropped into a brine of vinegar, salt, sugar, and pickling spices. They sat in that liquid for weeks. The whites turned translucent. The yolks went dense and creamy. A man could buy one for a nickel, eat it in 3 bites, and keep working for another 4 hours without his stomach growling. Just a jar, a pair of tongs, and a piece of wax paper if the store owner felt generous. In the coal camps of Harlan County, miners bought them by the half dozen before heading underground. The vinegar kept them from spoiling in the heat of the tunnels. Your grandfather probably ate 100 of them and never once called it a snack. He called it getting by. Hominy started with dried corn soaked in lye water, an alkaline solution made from wood ash, until the hull of each kernel loosened and the corn swelled to nearly twice its size. The process was nixtamalization, though that word never appeared in mountain kitchens where it had been practiced for generations. The critical knowledge was how to make the lye water right. Wood ash from a clean hardwood fire went into a barrel. Water poured through slowly and collected below, and the resulting liquid had to be strong enough to float a raw egg before it was ready. Too weak, and the corn would not hull. Too strong, and it dissolved. She knew by the color and the way it moved, knowledge learned by watching her grandmother, never by asking. In Cherokee cooking, nixtamalization of corn dated back centuries before European contact, and the Appalachian settlers who inherited the technique gained one of the most significant food processes in North American history. The hominy that came out had a silky, tender chew that nothing canned has matched. The sprinkler lived on the windowsill above the ironing board, a cork stopper fitted with a perforated aluminum head pushed into the neck of a soda bottle filled with plain water. You shook it over the fabric in slow passes before the iron came down, distributing moisture evenly so the cotton relaxed under the heat without scorching. The goal was damp, not wet. The way bread dough feels just before it rises, the fabric supple but not dripping. Steam irons made the sprinkler unnecessary, but in the years before them, and in plenty of houses well into the early 1960s, that cork and bottle contraption was the difference between a shirt that looked pressed and a shirt that looked like someone had ironed it in a hurry. Hardware stores sold the cork head for a few cents in the 1950s. A patient husband could make one from a cork and a thimble in an evening. She kept hers on the windowsill long after the steam iron came. It had been her mother's first, and then hers, and the bottle was the same one. The tomato had to be warm from the garden, not the refrigerator, never the store, and sliced thick enough that the juice ran down your wrist when you bit into the sandwich. 2 slices of soft white bread, a heavy spread of mayonnaise, thick rounds of a tomato still holding the heat of the afternoon sun, and enough salt to make the flavor crack open. This was lunch and sometimes supper across the entire American South. A meal so simple that writing it down felt insulting to the people who made it. Hellmann's, first mass-distributed in the 1920s, became the only acceptable brand. Using anything else was grounds for a kitchen argument that could last a whole summer. The sandwich existed only during tomato season. When the last vine died in September, it vanished, and no winter tomato from a grocery store could bring it back. If you told someone today you were baking a pie out of vinegar, water, and sugar, they would assume you had lost your mind. But in the 1850s, when lemons cost more than most families earned in a day and fresh fruit disappeared between November and May, Hill women figured out that a tablespoon of white vinegar in a custard filling produced a tartness close enough to lemon that nobody at the table complained. They called them desperation pies: vinegar, water, sugar cream, shoe fly, and everyone was built from whatever sat in the pantry when nothing else was coming. The shoofly pie started as a crustless molasses cake baked for the 1876 centennial, and the name came from the children who had to wave flies away from the pools of sweet molasses cooling on the windowsill. Bon Appetit ran a feature calling Desperation Pies a Comeback. The women who invented them would have been confused by the word comeback. They never left the kitchen in the first place. Those kitchen tricks kept daily cooking smooth, but some of the old methods reached back centuries, to a time when survival depended on knowing what to do with dried corn and a pile of wood ash. Making lye from hardwood ash to turn corn into hominy was one of the oldest cooking techniques in North America, learned from the Cherokee and other indigenous peoples long before anyone called it nixtamalization. You packed clean ash into a wooden hopper, poured water through it, and collected the alkaline liquid that dripped out the bottom. Dried corn soaked in that lye water for a day or two until the hulls loosened and slipped off and the kernels swelled to twice their size. The process unlocked niacin that the body cannot absorb from untreated corn. Without it, families who lived on corn developed pellagra. The old cooks did not know the word. They knew that treated corn kept people well and untreated corn did not, and they passed the method along without ever needing a laboratory to prove what their hands already understood. Apple scrap vinegar production turned kitchen waste into a valuable pantry staple that served dozens of purposes throughout the year. When Grandma peeled apples for pies or sauce, she saved every core and peeling in a crock covered with water and cloth. Over weeks, wild yeasts fermented the sugars into alcohol. Then bacteria transformed that alcohol into sharp, tangy vinegar. The process required patience, knowing when to stir, when to skim, when the vinegar was strong enough for use. The finished product preserved pickles, cleaned kitchen surfaces, dressed salads, and served as medicine for sore throats and digestive troubles. Some families kept mother of vinegar, the gelatinous culture that accelerated fermentation, passing it down through generations like sourdough starter. Making vinegar from scraps that would otherwise feed pigs demonstrated the mountain philosophy that nothing useful should ever be discarded. Every apple entering the kitchen gave twice, first as food, then as preservation tool. Burying potatoes in ash was one of the oldest cooking methods mountain families used before electric ovens existed in rural Appalachian communities. Fresh potatoes were nestled directly into warm ashes at the edge of a fireplace, covered completely until only coals surrounded them on all sides. The ash acted as insulation, slowly roasting potatoes over several hours until skins turned papery and insides became fluffy and sweet. Families learned exactly how deep to bury them through years of practice passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The technique required no pots, no pans, and no fuel beyond what was already heating the home. Children were sent to check potatoes by poking them with sticks, learning doneness through texture rather than timers. The finished potatoes emerged with subtle smokiness no modern oven could replicate. This method fed families through winters when other cooking options were limited and fuel was precious. Flour paste wallpaper adhesive was homemade glue that hung wallpaper, sealed envelopes, and repaired torn books without requiring store-bought products. The recipe called for cooking flour and water together over low heat until the mixture thickened into smooth paste. The result was strong, flexible adhesive that dried clear and held paper firmly against surfaces. Families used this paste to decorate their homes with wallpaper scraps, catalog pages, or newspaper sheets, brightening otherwise plain wooden walls. The same paste sealed important letters, repaired children's school books, and attached labels to canning jars. Making paste became a household skill passed from mothers to daughters, with each family adjusting flour-to-water ratios based on experience. The paste cost virtually nothing and worked as well as commercial products for most paper applications. It represented self-sufficiency, proving that basic cooking skills could solve problems far beyond the kitchen. Raising backyard chickens for eggs provided daily protein that cost almost nothing once the initial flock was established and self-sustaining through natural reproduction. Hens ate kitchen scraps, garden waste, insects, and minimal purchased feed while producing eggs that would cost significant money at stores. A small flock of 6 hens could provide more than enough eggs for a family, with surplus to barter with neighbors for other goods. The chickens themselves eventually became soup when egg production declined, meaning nothing was wasted in the cycle. Children gathered eggs as morning chores, learning responsibility while literally collecting breakfast. The birds required minimal space and equipment, making them accessible even for families with small properties. Backyard eggs tasted richer than store versions, with deep orange yolks that spoke to the varied diet the birds enjoyed. This single practice could eliminate one of the largest recurring grocery expenses entirely. Number 24. Cooking 3 meals from one Sunday chicken. Cooking 3 suppers off one bird was the rhythm of every hillbilly Sunday. One roasting hen carried Sunday dinner, Monday soup, and Tuesday pot pie. The bird went into the oven with sage and onion until the leg pulled clean from the joint. Monday morning, the carcass simmered into stock on the wood stove rim. Tuesday, the leftover meat went into the broth with biscuit dough rolled into dumplings. 1 bird, 3 suppers, 11 plates, and the bones still make the broth in your kitchen tonight. Number 19. Self-rising flour mixed at home from plain flour. The town store in Blairsville sold Martha White self-rising flour for 22 cents, more a bag than plain flour. Jewel did the math. She bought plain white lily flour in 25-pound sacks and mixed her own every Monday morning. 1 1/2 teaspoons of baking powder and 1/2 teaspoon of salt for every cup of flour. She blended it in a crock and kept it covered on the pantry shelf. Over a year, the savings added up to a pair of work boots, which in 1955 ran $7.95 at the Sears catalog. Nobody in town talked about it, because the women who did it had been taught by grandmothers who could not always read a label. They were not about to pay someone else for something they could mix in a crock. It is still the simplest hack you can teach your daughter in under 2 minutes. Number 25. Soup beans and cornbread. Vera Justice set a pot of pinto beans to soak at 5 in the morning before she walked her oldest to the school bus. By 3 in the afternoon, the beans were soft, the broth was thick, and a hunk of fatback had melted down into the pot. The cornbread went into the skillet at 3:50. It baked while she set the table. You could feed 6 people for under $1. The beans were 29 cents a pound at the company store. The cornmeal was 40 cents for a 5-pound sack. The only rule was that the bread had to be hot enough to melt butter when it hit the plate. Women in coal camps from Logan County to Harlan County made this same meal on the same schedule because their husbands came home on the same whistle. It was not a peasant dish. It was a working dinner that honored a working man. That mattered. Number 24. Moon pie and RC Cola. In 1961, you could walk into any general store in the mountains of Virginia, Tennessee, or Kentucky and buy both for a dime. The moon pie cost a nickel. The RC Cola cost a nickel. Together, they made what working people called the working man's lunch. The Chattanooga bakery had been making moon pies since 1917. 2 round graham cracker cookies with marshmallow in the middle dipped in chocolate, vanilla, or banana coating. 1 moon pie had enough calories to carry a man through an afternoon of splitting wood or hauling rock. The RC Cola washed it down. This was not a treat. This was fuel, and for 10 cents, it was the cheapest fuel in Appalachia. The head went to whoever had earned it, usually the grandmother who cooked the squirrel, and the one least likely to waste the part most people had decided wasn't worth bothering with. After the squirrel was stewed and the meat pulled from the legs and back, the head got set aside, and she cracked it open with the handle of a spoon and dug the brains out with the same casual economy she applied to everything else. Squirrel brains were considered a delicacy at Appalachian tables, small and rich and faintly sweet, eaten plain or scrambled into eggs, a use of the whole animal that dated to the earliest settlement of the mountains, when hunters who depended on small game could not afford to leave anything on the table. The children watched with the fascinated horror children reserve for adults doing things that seem impossible. Some grew up to find the brains on their plate without thinking twice. Others left the room. The ones who left the room are still missing something they cannot name. The machine arrived and immediately demanded respect. Sears sold a gasoline-powered wringer washer in the late 1930s, a loud, fume-producing contraption that had to stay outside, and getting one meant you were doing a little better than your neighbors. The wringer was 2 rubber rollers set close together, and you fed wet clothes through to press the water out. Efficient. Also waiting for a lapse in attention. A button left buttoned jammed the rollers with a sound that dropped your heart. A braid that swung forward while you leaned in could be pulled through before you registered what was happening. She kept her hair pinned and her sleeves rolled tight on wash day, always, and made her daughters do the same. They thought she was being particular. She was being specific about a danger she had seen with her own eyes and never talked about directly. The electric wringer washers of the 1950s were quieter and safer, but the rules stayed exactly the same in her house. Rules that come from a real reason have a way of outlasting the machines that made them necessary. But before anything could be stretched or seasoned, someone had to know what was safe to eat from the ground, and poke salad was the test that separated mountain cooks from everyone else. Phytolacca americana, pokeweed, grew wild along fence rows and ditch banks across the Appalachian South, and in early spring the young shoots were one of the first greens available to families who had eaten nothing fresh since autumn. The plant was toxic if handled wrong. You boiled the leaves 3 separate times, draining and replacing the water each round to pull the poison out before the greens were safe to eat. After the 3rd boil, you fried them in bacon grease with salt, and they turned dark, tender, and rich, tasting like a cross between spinach and asparagus. Cherokee and rural Appalachian families had been preparing poke this way for generations, and the knowledge passed by standing at the stove, not from any book. One wrong step, skipping a boil, picking leaves too mature, and the dish could make you sick. You either knew how or you didn't touch it. Same hands that fed that starter also rendered the fat. Every fall, when hog killing time came, the women cut the leaf fat from around the kidneys and the back fat from under the skin, chopped it into small pieces, and melted it down slow in a heavy pot until the kitchen filled with a smell that was equal parts rich and animal. The cracklings left behind, those crisp brown bits of rendered tissue, went straight into cornbread batter or got eaten warm with salt right off the stove. Lard was the only cooking fat most poor families could afford, and it made pie crusts that shattered at the touch of a fork and biscuits so flaky they barely held together. Doctors spent 40 years telling people to stop using it. Margarine and vegetable shortening replaced it on store shelves. Now, heritage lard sells for $15 a jar at specialty markets, and pastry chefs swear nothing else produces the same crust. The grandmothers who rendered it in their yards for free would have laughed themselves breathless. Using potato water as a base for bread dough and soups was a trick born from the simple refusal to waste anything, and the science behind it turned out to be remarkable. That starchy, cloudy liquid left over from boiling potatoes activated yeast faster than plain water, giving homemade bread a softer crumb and a longer shelf life. Pour it into a soup pot, and it thickened the broth naturally without needing a roux or a handful of flour stirred in at the end. Depression-era families figured this out by necessity. When you could barely afford the potatoes, you certainly were not pouring their cooking liquid down the drain. Grandmothers kept a pot on the back of the stove for exactly this purpose, ladling the water into jars to cool and use later. Bread made with potato water rose higher and stayed soft a full day longer, and the soups it went into had body and richness that people could not explain but could always taste. The water looked like nothing. It cooked like everything. Stretching coffee with chicory root or roasted barley was how mountain families kept their morning ritual alive when real coffee was too expensive or unavailable at country stores. Grandma would dig chicory roots from roadsides, scrub them clean, slice them thin, and roast them slowly until dark brown and brittle. Ground fine and mixed with whatever coffee the family could afford, chicory added body and a slightly bitter earthiness that many people actually preferred. Some families roasted barley, rye, or dried corn kernels as coffee stretchers, creating blends so familiar children grew up thinking that was how coffee tasted. During the Depression and war years, these substitutes sometimes replaced coffee entirely, yet families gathered around kitchen tables just the same, warming hands on mugs filled with dark, steaming liquid. The practice taught that ritual and togetherness mattered more than expensive ingredients and that resourcefulness preserved normalcy during hard times. Drying apples on string lines was the preservation method that turned autumn abundance into winter sustenance without any special equipment or expensive supplies. Apple slices were threaded onto long strings using needles, then hung from rafters, porches, or any warm, dry spot where air could circulate freely around each piece. The process took days or weeks depending on humidity, with families checking constantly for signs of mold or insect damage. Properly dried apples shriveled into leathery rings that could be stored in cloth bags for months without spoiling. Come winter, these dried slices were rehydrated in water or cider and cooked into pies, cobblers, and fried pies that tasted of concentrated sweetness. Children helped with threading, learning patience and satisfaction of preparing for harder times. The strings became decorative as well as practical, hanging in kitchens where their sweet smell mixed with wood smoke. Newspaper window insulation was the original weatherproofing solution that mountain families relied on when cold winds whistled through drafty cabins. Families collected old newspapers throughout the year, saving them specifically for winter when temperatures plummeted and heating fuel was precious. The technique involved wetting the newspaper slightly, then pressing it firmly against window glass where it would dry and adhere, creating a barrier against cold air. Some families layered multiple sheets, building up thickness that trapped air pockets and reduced heat loss dramatically. The newspaper could be peeled away come spring without damaging the glass, and the cost was absolutely nothing since papers were subscribed to or scavenged from town. Children often helped with this annual ritual, learning early that comfort didn't require spending money when clever thinking was available. The yellowed papers gave windows a peculiar tint, but nobody minded when the alternative was shivering through January nights. Buying day-old bread from bakeries at half price or less was a weekly ritual that smart rural families never missed when trips to town allowed shopping opportunities. Bakeries and grocery stores marked down yesterday's loaves to clear shelf space, offering perfectly good bread at fractions of the original cost. Mountain wives arrived early, knowing the best selection went fast to families who understood this simple trick. The bread worked perfectly for toast, sandwiches, breadcrumbs, bread pudding, stuffing, and French toast, where freshness mattered less than price. Some families bought enough day-old bread to last the week, storing loaves in cool pantries or even freezing them when electricity reached the hollows. Children ate sandwiches made from bread that cost pennies per loaf, never tasting any difference from the expensive fresh version. This single habit could cut bread expenses by 60% or more, freeing money for protein and vegetables. Number 14. Making chow chow from the last things in the garden. "The garden corners make the best relish," she said every October. Your grandmother walked the rows on the last warm day of October, pulling green tomatoes the frost had not finished, small heads of cabbage and cucumbers that had gone tough. She chopped everything fine, salted it heavy with 3 tablespoons of pickling salt to every 5 pounds, and hung it in a pillowcase from the porch rail overnight. By morning, the cloth had drained pale green water onto the porch boards in a slow, steady stream. She boiled the salted vegetables with vinegar, sugar, and mustard seed, ladled them into half-pint jars, and sealed the lids in a hot water bath. The relish on the cellar shelf turned a plate of pinto beans and cornbread into something different every supper from November through March. The cheapest condiment on the table was always the one the grocery store never sold. Number 23. Leather britches beans strung on thread. In late August of 1955, the green beans came in by the bushel, and Jewel could not can them all. The glass jars cost money. Lids were still rationed in her memory from the war. So she sat on the cabin porch with a tin bowl of half-runner beans, a sewing needle, and a length of white cotton thread. She ran the needle through the middle of each bean and slid it down the thread like a bead. A full string held 100 beans. She hung the strings from the rafters of the cabin loft, out of the sun, and let them shrivel for 6 weeks. They looked like small leather breeches that had been soaked and dried. Back then, every cabin in Union County had strings of them swinging in the loft. Come January, she dropped a handful into a pot with fatback and water and simmered them 4 hours. Supper cost nothing but time. A quart jar of canned beans cost 14 cents, but leather breeches cost 0. Multiply by 40 supper nights and you see why she strung them every year. Number 22. Skillet cornbread with buttermilk. Every hillbilly kitchen in West Virginia, Kentucky, and East Tennessee had the same ritual. A black cast-iron skillet lived on the middle rack of the oven. You preheated it with a spoonful of bacon grease inside. When the grease popped and smoked, you poured the cornmeal batter in and listened for the sizzle. The bread baked in 22 minutes flat. The bottom came out crisp and dark, the top was golden, and the edges pulled away from the skillet clean. You crumbled it into a glass of cold buttermilk and ate it with an iced teaspoon. A miner's wife in Letcher County could make this in 15 minutes between the time the children came home from school and the time the whistle blew. A 5-pound sack of cornmeal fed a family for 10 days. The buttermilk came from the grocery in a paper carton, 29 cents a quart. It was simple, cheap, and transformed a handful of meal into a meal. Number 23. Peanuts in a Coca-Cola bottle. You bought a 6-ounce glass bottle of Coca-Cola for a nickel. You bought a small bag of salted peanuts for a nickel. Then you poured the peanuts directly into the bottle. The salt hit the carbonation and the cola fizzed up. You drank and chewed at the same time. Nobody knows exactly who started this, but it was everywhere across the rural South by the 1920s, and it was still going strong in 1962. Farmers did it. Miners did it. Mill workers did it. A man working in a tobacco field had dirty hands. Pouring the peanuts into the bottle meant he did not have to touch his food. He could hold the bottle with one hand and keep working with the other. That was the genius of it. Not the taste, though the sweet and salty combination was good. The genius was that it let a working man eat without stopping. You had to know the creek bottoms to find them, and you had to know the exact week, because a pawpaw not yet ripe was hard and bitter and useless, and a pawpaw one day past ready was already fermenting on the ground with the yellow jackets on it. The Asimina triloba, North America's largest native fruit, tasting of banana mixed with vanilla and something almost tropical, ripened for about 3 weeks in late August through September in the creek hollows of Appalachia, and the families who ate them had their patches marked in memory since their grandparents' time. You pressed the skin gently. If it gave like a ripe avocado, it was ready. You carried them home wrapped in a shirt because nothing bruised faster, and ate them the same day or turned them into pawpaw butter before the next sunrise. Lewis and Clark documented pawpaws on their 1804 expedition as a critical food source during lean stretches. She knew the patch, the week, and the press test. The trees are still out there. The knowledge of where to look is getting harder to find. Monday was not a suggestion. In Appalachian households from the 1920s through the 1960s, wash day fell on Monday the way sunrise fell in the East, without discussion, without exception. American domestic manuals as far back as the mid-1800s had established Monday as the accepted wash day, and the tradition held in mountain communities long after it had faded elsewhere. The clothes had been sorted and soaked Sunday evening, and by first light Monday she was already outside feeding the fire under the wash pot. The order was fixed. Whites in first while the water was cleanest, work clothes last when the suds were spent. If she washed on a Tuesday, the neighbors noticed. A clothesline standing empty on Monday afternoon told the whole road something was wrong inside. Sickness, a baby coming, grief. The rhythm of the week was built around that one day's labor, and the women who kept the household on something stronger than schedule. It was the last thing she managed before the hospital. The line stood empty every Monday after that, and the whole road understood without being told. Fried potatoes and onions cooked in saved bacon grease was a meal that appeared on tables across the Appalachian South 3 or 4 nights a week. Potatoes sliced thin, a rough chopped onion, and a heavy spoonful of drippings from that jar, all pressed flat in a cast-iron skillet and cooked without stirring until the bottom turned golden and crisp. You flipped it in sections, not all at once, and the onions went sweet and dark against the edges of the potatoes. In the 1950s, a 10-pound bag of potatoes cost around 35 cents, and a single bag could stretch across a full week of suppers. The grease was free, saved from breakfast, from Sunday's fatback, from every strip of bacon that ever touched that pan. Nobody measured. You scooped until the skillet looked right. That instinct died with the women who owned those jars. During the Depression, you could not find a dandelion in northern Illinois. They were eaten as fast as they appeared. That was not a gardening choice. It was survival. The bright green leaves that most people now spray with weed killer were the only fresh vegetables some families had access to in early spring, and they were packed with more iron, calcium, and vitamins than anything sitting on a grocery store shelf. Your grandmother knew to pick them young, before the flowers opened, when the leaves were still tender enough to eat raw with a little vinegar and bacon fat drizzled on top. She boiled the older ones 3 times to pull out the bitterness, the same technique she used on poke greens and mustard. Now, urban foraging classes charge $60 a session to teach people how to identify what every poor family already knew was growing in their own front yard. The greens have not changed. The people picking them have. Adding a pinch of salt to coffee grounds before brewing was something the old folks did without explaining why, and if you asked, they just said it tasted better. They were right. The sodium blocks bitter compounds on your tongue, smoothing out the harshness of cheap, over-roasted beans, the only kind most rural families could afford. A 1/4 teaspoon in the grounds before the water hit was all it took. Alton Brown brought this trick to television decades later and acted like it was a discovery, but women in Appalachian kitchens had been doing it since the early 1900s with the rough ground coffee they bought in bulk from the general store. You did not need to understand the chemistry. You just watched your grandmother add that tiny pinch without measuring, and you tasted the difference in the first cup. The coffee came out rounder, smoother, less like something you had to choke down. Nobody writes it on the bag. You either grew up knowing or you did not. Stale bread transformation was an art form in mountain kitchens where throwing away food was considered sinful. Grandma never discarded hardened loaves or dried-out biscuits. Instead, she saw raw materials for entirely new dishes. Stale bread became bread pudding when combined with eggs, milk, sugar, and whatever spices were available, baked golden and served warm with cream. Dried biscuits were crushed into crumbs for coating fried foods or stretching meatloaf, adding texture while reducing expensive ground meat. Old cornbread was crumbled into buttermilk for quick breakfast or mixed with onions and sage for holiday dressing. Some grandmas dried bread completely, storing it in cloth bags for months. The practice extended to every baked good. Stale cake became trifle, old pie crust became soup crackers. Children grew up understanding that freshness was temporary, but usefulness was permanent, that every ingredient deserved multiple lives before finally feeding the chickens or pigs. Using vinegar to tenderize meat was how mountain families transformed tough cuts into something approaching luxury without spending money they did not have available. A few splashes of apple cider vinegar added to the marinade broke down tough muscle fibers in wild game and older livestock that would otherwise require hours of cooking. Families made their own vinegar from apple scraps, so the ingredient cost nothing beyond initial effort. The acid worked slowly overnight, penetrating deep into meat while adding subtle tanginess that complemented strong flavors of venison, squirrel, and tough old roosters. Women learned exact proportions through generations of practice, knowing how much was enough to tenderize without making meat mushy. The marinated meat could then be fried, roasted, or stewed with significantly shorter cooking times. This trick made poor cuts taste like quality and stretched limited protein into satisfying meals. Vinegar copper cleaner transformed tarnished pots, pans, and hardware into gleaming surfaces using nothing but pantry vinegar and table salt. The method was simple enough that children could help with the task, mixing white vinegar with salt to create a paste that cut through oxidation and grime. Families would rub this mixture onto copper surfaces using old rags or their bare hands, watching dark tarnish dissolve away to reveal the warm orange metal underneath. The chemical reaction between acid and salt broke down the oxidized layer without scratching or damaging the copper beneath. Mountain households took pride in their copper cookware, often passed down through generations, and this cleaning method kept heirloom pieces functional and beautiful. The same mixture worked on brass door hardware, cabinet pulls, and decorative items throughout the home. No store-bought polish could match the effectiveness or the satisfaction of watching grime disappear. Canning everything possible during harvest season transformed summer abundance into year-round food security that freed families from winter grocery dependence entirely. Women worked marathon sessions over boiling water bath canners and pressure cookers, putting up tomatoes, green beans, corn, pickles, jams, and anything else the garden produced. The investment in jars and lids paid dividends for decades as containers cycled through endless seasons of filling, eating, and refilling. A well-stocked cellar held hundreds of jars representing thousands of meals that required no additional grocery spending. Families counted their preserved food like savings accounts, knowing exactly how many weeks of eating lined those shelves. Children grew up understanding the connection between summer labor and winter security in ways that store-bought food could never teach. This practice meant grocery lists stayed short even when money ran shorter. Number 16. Tearing day-old bread into hot milk for a paid-for supper. Tearing yesterday's biscuits into a saucepan with warm milk was the supper a coal camp mother served on the nights the cupboard was bare otherwise. She poured 2 cups of pet whole milk into the pot, tore 4 hard biscuits into thumb-sized chunks, and stirred in a spoon of sugar, salt, and a slice of butter from the icebox. 3 minutes over a soft burner. The bread softened into something between pudding and porridge. She ladled it into chipped enamel bowls and set the children at the table. They called it bread and milk in Letcher County, and a whole pot fed 4 for under 15 cents in 1965. The supper that fed 4 bellies to bed full is still the cheapest meal in your kitchen tonight. Number 22. Salt curing pork in the smokehouse. The hog was killed the first cold week of December in 1955 when the temperature held below 40 for 3 days straight. Jewel and her husband used 10 pounds of salt for every 100 pounds of meat. They rubbed it into the shoulder, the belly, the ham, every crevice. The meat went on waist-high shelves in the log smokehouse and sat for 6 weeks while the winter cold did the work a refrigerator would have done. Then a low hickory fire was built under the meat for 2 days until the ham turned mahogany. That ham hung in the smokehouse through the next summer. 1 hog fed the family for a year. Back then, a pound of cured ham at the Blairsville store cost 69 cents, but a home-cured ham from a home-raised hog cost nothing but salt and patience. And that is the math your great-grandmother ran every December. Number 24. Fried bologna sandwich. In Mingo County, bologna was called poor man's steak, and nobody said it with shame. A thick slice hit a hot cast-iron skillet, the edges curled up into a bowl, and within 90 seconds, It was done. You slapped it between two slices of soft white bread with a smear of yellow mustard. That was the whole recipe. Children carried these to the elementary school in Matewan wrapped in wax paper. Coal miners carried them down into the shaft in metal buckets. The bologna was 69 cents a pound at Piggly Wiggly in 1973. A loaf of bread was 35 cents. A family of 6 could eat for under $2. The sandwich was simple, it was hot, and it was on the table before your husband finished washing the coal dust out of the sink. Nobody called it cheap. They called it supper. Number 21, fried apple pies. In the hollows of southern Appalachia, women dried apples on racks in the late summer sun, spreading the slices across old window screens propped up on sawhorses. Those dried apples went into a jar and lasted through the winter. When someone wanted a snack, a woman would soak a handful in water until they softened, cook them down with sugar and cinnamon, then fold the filling into circles of biscuit dough and fry them in a skillet of hot lard. The edges went golden and crisp. The filling turned soft and sweet and warm. Some families called them half-moon pies because of the shape. In Letcher County, Kentucky, a woman named Hazel Caudle was known to make 3 dozen on a Saturday morning and sell them for $0.10 apiece at the back door. They were gone before noon. She made the mush at night when supper was done because it needed all night to set. Cornmeal went into salted boiling water and she stirred it until it thickened past porridge, dense enough to hold the spoon's path for a moment before closing. A process that took 40 minutes of constant attention. She poured it into a bread loaf pan, smoothed the top flat, and left it on the counter until morning. By dawn, it had firmed into a sliceable loaf. She cut it into half-inch slabs and fried each one in bacon grease until the outside was golden and crisped, while the inside stayed soft. Called mersh by some families in the hill communities of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, fried cornmeal mush was food that required nothing special and wasted nothing. Every bit left from supper became something better at breakfast. The crackle of the crust is what the children who grew up on it still remember. Their grandchildren do not know the dish exists. It cost a morning's fire to heat and a full afternoon to use, and not one drop went to waste. The first rinse water, warm and slightly soapy, went onto the kitchen garden. Beans and squash and tomatoes didn't mind a trace of soap. In fact, it helped knock back the aphids working the underside of the leaves. The second rinse water, cooler and cleaner, went to the hog pen or down the drain hole. The wash water itself, heavy with gray suds and a week's accumulated grime, scrubbed the porch boards before it soaked into the dirt. Nothing was hauled twice. Every bucket served its purpose in descending order, from cleanest use to dirtiest, until it was spent. A family that hauled every drop from the well had no intention of making the trip more times than the work required. Nothing was hauled twice. That was not a philosophy. That was the whole system. There was a time when the last meal of the day cost nothing but a fistful of cold cornbread and whatever buttermilk was left in the jar. Cornbread crumbled into buttermilk, eaten from a glass with a long spoon, was supper for families across Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the rural Deep South from the Depression years straight through the 1970s. The cornbread had to be cold, at least a few hours old, firm enough to hold its shape when the buttermilk hit it. You crumbled it by hand, poured the buttermilk over, and ate it standing at the counter or sitting on the porch in the dark. A full glass cost less than 3 cents in the 1940s. It required no stove, no heat, no preparation beyond the breaking of bread. The people who ate this every night did not call it a recipe. They called it Tuesday. The jar of bacon grease beside the stove was the most important ingredient in the kitchen, and nobody who grew up in these houses ever threw it away. The sound of jars sealing was the sound of winter taken care of. That faint pop, one after another, coming from the counter where the ball jars cooled. Every lid that sucked down tight meant one more week your family would eat. The women started before dawn in August, standing over boiling water baths in kitchens with no air conditioning, peeling tomatoes until their fingers turned red and raw. Green beans, corn, peaches, pickled beets, chow relish. The cellar shelves filled row by row like a library of everything the garden had given. You learned which recipes needed a pressure canner and which ones could water bath. And you learned it the hard way if you got it wrong, because a jar of green beans sealed without enough heat could kill you. Now canning kits sell for $300, and TikTok videos with billions of views teach what used to pass from mother to daughter without a single word written down. Soaking wild game in buttermilk overnight was the hunter's trick that every mountain family knew and most modern cooks have never heard of. Venison, rabbit, squirrel, anything that came out of the woods with that sharp, iron-heavy flavor got dropped into a bowl of buttermilk and left in the cold overnight or sometimes 2 full days. The lactic acid broke down the tough muscle fibers gently without turning the meat to mush the way vinegar sometimes did, and the calcium triggered enzymes that softened the protein from the inside. What came out the next morning was tender, mild, and ready to flour and fry without any gamey bite. The old women never talked about enzymes. They said the buttermilk pulled the wild out of it, and that was explanation enough. You rinsed it, patted it dry, and seasoned it. Nobody at the table ever knew it had been running through the hollow 2 days before. Pot liquor was never discarded in a hillbilly kitchen because Grandma understood that the murky liquid left after boiling greens contained more nutrition than the vegetables themselves. When collards, turnip greens, or wild poke salad simmered for hours with a ham hock or fatback, the cooking water absorbed vitamins, minerals, and rich pork flavor. Rather than pouring this treasure down the drain, families saved pot liquor for drinking straight from cups, for soaking cornbread, or for soup and gravy bases. Elders believed it cured everything from winter colds to weak constitutions. The iron and vitamins helped prevent deficiencies common in communities with limited food variety. Children learned to love the salty taste, dunking cornbread until it softened into something between soup and porridge. Some families kept liquor warming on the stove for days, adding fresh water and vegetables as needed. This humble byproduct represented the mountain philosophy of waste nothing and nourish everyone. Making gravy from pan drippings was the technique that turned every meat dish into 2 meals and wasted nothing in kitchens where every calorie counted toward survival. After frying or roasting meat, the browned bits and rendered fat left in the pan became foundation for rich gravies that stretched protein into something more filling. Flour was sprinkled directly into hot fat and stirred constantly until it formed a paste that cooked to golden brown, developing deep, nutty flavors. Milk, water, or broth was added slowly while stirring to prevent lumps, creating smooth gravy that captured every bit of flavor from the original meat. Children learned to make gravy by standing beside mothers at the stove, learning exact motions and timing that defined good cooking. The gravy was poured over biscuits, potatoes, and cornbread, making small amounts of meat feed large families. Nothing was scraped into garbage when this knowledge lived in households. Soap sliver ball was a thrifty bathroom hack that transformed unusable soap remnants into functional new bars through simple household chemistry. Families saved every soap sliver too small to use effectively, collecting them in jars or bowls until enough accumulated. The slivers were then moistened, pressed together firmly, and molded by hand into new bars that worked as well as fresh soap. Some families added hot water to soften the pieces before combining them, creating smoother finished products. Others grated the slivers and packed them into molds, producing bars with interesting marbled patterns. Children often helped with this project, enjoying the tactile satisfaction of squishing soap pieces together. The practice eliminated waste entirely, ensuring that every bit of purchased soap served its purpose. This hack represented the mountain philosophy that throwing away useful material was simply unacceptable when creativity could extend its life. Catching and preserving fish from local streams and ponds provided free protein that required only time, basic equipment, and knowledge of where fish lived and what they ate. Mountain families knew their local waters intimately, understanding seasonal patterns that made catching easier during spawning runs or feeding times. Caught fish were eaten fresh, smoked, salted, or canned depending on quantity and preservation resources available. A successful fishing trip could provide protein for weeks when properly preserved, costing nothing but the labor of catching and processing. Children learned to fish young, gaining skills that would feed them throughout their lives regardless of economic circumstances. The practice connected families to waterways in their communities, building knowledge passed through generations. Fish represented truly free food for those willing to invest time instead of money, a trade mountain families made gladly. Number 22. Buying chicken backs and necks for scraps. Buying the bony parts of a chicken instead of the breast was the trick that fed twice as much for a third of the price. The butcher trimmed the parts the town families never wanted and sold them by the pound. They went into a heavy iron pot with cold water, half an onion, and a celery rib. 3 hours of simmer pulled every shred of meat off the bone. Spoonfuls of biscuit dough fell into the broth. The pot turned into tender shredded chicken, thick yellow broth, and pillowy dumplings. An old hen makes the strongest stock. Number 25. Bacon grease saved in a tin on the windowsill. Jewel kept a tin labeled Maxwell House on the sill behind the cook stove, and the grease inside had been refilled for decades. Every morning in 1955, she fried 4 strips of bacon, lifted them out, and poured the warm fat through a square of cheesecloth into the tin. The next meal started with a spoon of that grease. Cornbread cooked in it, eggs cooked in it, greens wilted in it, beans picked up their salt and smoke from it. A jar of good bacon grease in a mountain kitchen was the difference between a meal that tasted like something and a meal that tasted like nothing. She did not throw it out when it turned dark. She said the dark grease was the best grease. That tin cost her nothing. And a store-bought pound of lard at the Blairsville A&P cost 21 cents. Over a year, she saved $11 keeping that tin full. Your grandmother probably had one too. Simple, cheap, effective. Number 21. Fried taters and onions. The potatoes were left over from last night's supper, cold and already peeled, sitting in a bowl on the back of the stove. You sliced them thin, threw them into a cast-iron skillet with a yellow onion and a spoonful of bacon grease, and let them crisp up while the coffee perked. 12 minutes, start to finish. Hillbilly families in Wise County, Virginia, ate this for breakfast, for lunch, and sometimes as the whole supper when payday was still 3 days out. Potatoes were a nickel a pound at the Greenbrier Valley Piggly Wiggly. An onion was 2 cents. A pan of fried taters and onions fed 4 children and 2 adults for under 20 cents. There was nothing beautiful about it on the plate, but it smelled like a coal camp Saturday morning, and it was hot, and it filled you up until the mine whistle blew at noon. Number 17. Sorghum taffy. In the early 1960s, sorghum syrup was still the primary sweetener in many mountain homes. Refined white sugar was expensive. Sorghum was not. Families grew their own cane, pressed it in a horse-drawn mill, and cooked the juice down into a dark, thick syrup. When there was extra sorghum, the women made taffy. They boiled the syrup with a splash of vinegar until it reached the hard crack stage, poured it onto a buttered platter, and waited until it was cool enough to handle. Then the pulling started. 2 people would stretch and fold the candy between them until it turned from dark brown to pale golden and went stiff. They snapped it into pieces and wrapped each one in wax paper. In the mountains of eastern Tennessee, communities held taffy pulling parties in the fall. Young men and women paired off to pull the candy together. It was one of the few socially acceptable ways for unmarried people to hold hands. The taffy was the excuse. The company was the point. Nobody measured the cornmeal. You wet your hands, scooped from the bag, added salt water until the meal clumped without falling apart, and shaped it into an oval in your palms, flat on the bottom, rounded on top. Corn pone was older than the cast-iron skillet itself. The earliest versions were baked on a hoe blade held over an open fire, which is where the name hoe cake came from in the communities that used both words interchangeably. Pone was the bread of weeks when a family couldn't spare the buttermilk or eggs that cornbread required. Nothing but meal, water, salt, and heat. The outside went hard and golden, developing a crust that crackled under pressure, while the inside stayed dense and slightly gummy, and that texture was the point. It held up in a bowl of beans without dissolving. You never used a spoon to shape it. If you needed a spoon, you weren't ready to make it. She shaped 12 pones in the time it took most people to find a recipe card, moving through the routine so automatically she could do it in the dark, and everyone came out the same. Long before the wringer washer arrived with its rubber rollers and roaring engine, the iron wash pot was the center of laundry day. It sat on 3 legs over a wood fire in the yard, wide-mouthed and black with decades of use, and on Monday morning your grandmother had it going before the children were awake. White clothes went in first, sheets, pillowcases, undergarments, with a chunk of lye soap and a wooden paddle long enough to keep her arms clear of the steam. She boiled them 15 to 20 minutes, stirring, the water thickening with dissolved soil into something the color of weak broth. Stains that survived the board often didn't survive the boil. This method, bucking, in the old Scots-Irish laundry tradition that arrived in Appalachia with the original settlers, was practiced continuously in the region from the 1700s through the early 20th century. Some households kept the pot in the yard well into the 1950s, not because they had to, but because the boil got whites cleaner than the machine managed. She said the machine washed clothes. The pot made them honest. Tomato gravy started the same way sawmill gravy did. Bacon drippings in a hot skillet, a spoonful of flour stirred in. But where sawmill gravy reached for milk, tomato gravy reached for the canning jar. Home canned tomatoes, crushed by hand into the roux, turned the gravy a deep orange red and gave it a sweetness that the pepper-heavy sawmill version never had. A pinch of sugar went in if the tomatoes were too sharp, and the gravy cooked down until it was thick enough to sit on a split biscuit without running off the edges. Across the rural South through the 1940s and 50s, tomato gravy was breakfast, served alongside whatever the kitchen could produce: eggs if the hens were laying, a slice of cured ham if the smokehouse still had one. The color told you what kind of morning it was. Pale gravy meant milk was plentiful. Red gravy meant the cow had gone dry and the tomatoes were filling in. In the 1950s, if you smelled like ramps, people knew exactly where you came from and what you could not afford. That sharp, garlicky stink clung to your clothes and your breath for days, and it marked you as poor, as mountain, as someone who dug food out of the dirt instead of buying it at a store. The Cherokee had been harvesting ramps every spring for centuries before that stigma existed, pulling the wild leeks from shaded coves when the forest floor was still cold, eating them raw or fried with eggs and potatoes to thin the blood after a long winter. Ramp suppers were community events in West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, the first fresh green thing after months of dried beans and canned goods. Now those same ramps sell for $20 a pound at farmers markets in Brooklyn, and Sean Brock built part of his restaurant empire around Appalachian ingredients that used to embarrass the people who ate them. The mountains did not change. The price tag did. Using a dusting of baking soda to tenderize cheap cuts of meat was a quiet kitchen secret that turned round steak and stew beef into something you could actually chew. The alkaline powder raised the pH on the meat's surface, preventing the proteins from bonding too tightly during cooking. The same science behind the Chinese technique called velveting, arrived at independently by rural cooks who had never heard the word. You rubbed 3/4 of a teaspoon onto a pound of sliced beef, let it sit 15 minutes, rinsed it, and patted it dry before seasoning. The difference was immediate. Meat that would have been chewy and gray came out tender and browned, with a texture that tasted like a better cut. Families who could not afford sirloin used this to make chuck and bottom round worth sitting down for. The soda cost almost nothing and worked every time. Salt curing pork was the foundation of meat preservation in mountain communities, transforming fresh cuts into shelf-stable protein that sustained families through winter. Immediately after hog butchering in cold weather, Grandma rubbed every surface of hams, shoulders, and bacon slabs with coarse salt, mixed with a little sugar and saltpeter. The salted meat was packed in wooden boxes or barrels, covered with more salt, and left in cold outbuildings for several weeks. The salt drew moisture from the meat while penetrating deep into the flesh, creating conditions where bacteria couldn't survive. Larger cuts required longer curing times. Big hams might sit in salt for 6 weeks before being ready. After curing, Excess salt was scrubbed off and the meat either hung in smokehouses or stored in cloth bags in cool pantries. Before cooking, salt pork required overnight soaking to remove excess saltiness. The practice demanded understanding of temperatures, timing, and salt quantities that varied based on meat thickness and weather conditions. Cooking on the shovel blade was frontier ingenuity at its most practical when families lacked proper cookware or needed quick meals away from the kitchen hearth. A flat-bladed shovel, cleaned thoroughly and heated over open flames, became an instant griddle for frying eggs, toasting bread, or cooking small portions of meat. Field workers carried shovels anyway, making them dual-purpose tools that fed hungry workers during long days away from home. The metal heated evenly when held at the right angle over flames, and the long handle kept hands safe from the fire. Fathers showed sons how to judge temperature by watching metal change color and feeling heat radiating upward. Food cooked directly on the blade picked up a faint mineral taste that became associated with outdoor work and simple satisfaction. This technique required no additional equipment and worked anywhere a fire could be built, making it invaluable for remote work. Kerosene stain remover was a powerful cleaning solution that lifted grease, oil, and stubborn marks from fabric when commercial products were unavailable or unaffordable. Families kept kerosene on hand for lamps and heaters, discovering its secondary use as a remarkably effective degreaser. Small amounts dabbed onto stained fabric would dissolve grease and oil that water couldn't touch, lifting marks from work clothes and kitchen linens. The technique required careful application and thorough washing afterward to remove the kerosene smell, but the results justified the extra effort. Mechanics and farmers especially valued this hack, knowing their heavily soiled work clothes could be salvaged rather than discarded. Women shared the technique at quilting bees and church gatherings, spreading practical knowledge through community networks. The kerosene cost nothing extra since families already stocked it, making this hack purely about creative repurposing of existing resources. Stretching ground meat with oatmeal was one of the oldest and most effective tricks passed down through generations of mountain families who understood that a pound of beef could become two with the right technique. Women would mix a cup of raw oatmeal into every pound of ground meat, adding an egg to bind everything together and seasonings to mask the grain. The oatmeal absorbed the meat juices during cooking, swelling into something that tasted remarkably close to pure beef while doubling the volume. This wasn't just about saving money, though a pound of oatmeal cost pennies compared to another pound of meat. The oatmeal actually improved the texture, keeping meatloaves moist and meatballs tender in ways that pure beef couldn't match. Families used this trick for everything from hamburger patties to chili to spaghetti sauce, feeding 8 mouths on what should have fed 4. The children never knew the difference, and parents smiled knowing their grocery budget stretched twice as far. Number 19. Cooking pinto beans from a 25-pound sack. Soaking 2 cups of beans overnight in a stoneware bowl was the first move every Sunday night in a hillbilly kitchen. Your grandmother bought a camellia or pinto brand sack at the IGA for under $4 in 1965. The IGA and Hazard sold the same camellia bag every Friday. She drained the soaked beans Monday morning, slid them into a heavy iron pot with a piece of fat back, covered them with 3 inches of water, and let the rear of the wood stove do the rest of the work all day. By supper, the beans were tender, the broth was thick like a slow river, and the smell had pulled the children to the kitchen door an hour early. The pot fed 7. The leftovers fed them again on Tuesday. The same long simmer still works in your kitchen. The math has not changed in 60 years. Number 16. Storing potatoes in sand in the root cellar. Jewel's potato crop, about 300 pounds from the backfield, went into the dugout root cellar behind the cabin the second week of October, 1955. Her husband had dug down 4 feet, lined the walls with field stone, and built a plank ceiling over it. Inside, she layered the potatoes in clean river sand from Coosa Creek, each one barely touching the next, the sand keeping them dry and dark and cool. A bushel of sand held 50 pounds of potatoes. The sand pulled moisture away from the skin and stopped the sprouts from starting. Not one potato sprouted before March. Every farm in Union County did the same, some with sand, some with sawdust, some with dry oak leaves. The temperature inside the cellar held at 48 degrees year-round. Jewel pulled the first spring potato in April, firm and fresh, 8 months after harvest. You can build a working root cellar in your backyard today for under $100. Number 19. Pinto beans with fatback. The beans soaked overnight in a chipped enamel pot. The fatback, a white slab of salt pork streaked with pink, went in at sunrise with a diced onion and a quart of water. You set the burner to low and walked away. By 4 in the afternoon, the kitchen smelled like smoke and simmered beans, and the pot liquor at the bottom was thick enough to sop up with a biscuit. A pound of pintos cost 29 cents in 1974. A quarter pound of fatback cost 15 cents. The meal fed 5 people for under 50 cents a day. In Buchanan County, Virginia, women made this on Mondays because it lasted 3 days and the flavor deepened each time it was reheated. It was cheap, it was simple, and it held a working family together across a week. Number 14. Sassafras tea. In the early spring, before the trees fully leafed out, children in the mountains dug sassafras roots from the edges of fields and woods. The roots were easy to spot because the whole plant smelled like root beer. You washed them, cut them into pieces, and boiled them in a pot of water until the liquid turned a deep reddish brown. Then you added sugar or honey and drank it warm or let it cool. Sassafras tea was free. It grew everywhere. And it tasted exactly like root beer because root beer was originally made from sassafras. In the 1960s, every child in rural Appalachia knew how to find a sassafras tree. They knew it by the smell, by the mitten-shaped leaves, by the way the bark peeled. Grandmothers said it purified the blood. Whether that was true did not matter. What mattered was that a child could walk into the woods with nothing and come back with something that tasted sweet and warm. That is what foraging meant to mountain children, not survival, discovery. In late September, when the garden was giving its last and the cold was moving down off the ridges, she was already at the stove with every salvageable vegetable she could pull. Green tomatoes, hot peppers, cabbage, onions, snap beans, chopping it fine and cooking it down with vinegar, mustard seed, turmeric, and sugar into chow chow. It had an eye-watering smell while it cooked and an entirely different smell once it hit the jar, settling into something sharp and sweet and bright that lasted all winter on a spoon of beans or a piece of fatback. Chow chow was the insurance policy against a bland February, the condiment built from everything the garden had left before the first hard freeze took it. Nothing went to the compost that could still be put up. The practice of pickling end-of-garden vegetables into a spiced relish was documented across Appalachia and the broader American South from at least the mid-19th century, with regional variations in heat from Virginia down through Georgia. Once the jars sealed with that pop, the winter felt a little shorter. The sound was different depending on what you were washing. Cotton shirts made a brisk scraping, short strokes, working with the weave. Denim moved slower, pressed harder, a lower sound that meant your wrists were in it. You never used a circular motion on anything you wanted to keep the shape of. You learned this not from instructions but from ruining things. A collar torn off a school shirt, a flannel that thinned to gauze after 2 seasons. By the time you were trusted with the washboard alone, you already knew which section of the board she used for collars and which for knees, and how she shifted her weight on a heavy piece. Glass washboards, preferred for finer fabrics because the smoother surface was gentler than zinc metal, were standard in many Appalachian households through the 1940s. Nobody explained the difference between the glass and the zinc board. You watched long enough and then you simply knew, the way you knew which pot she used for beans and which she never touched for anything else. The sound came first, a sharp hiss when hot bacon grease hit raw greens, and then the smell of vinegar rising in a cloud of steam that filled the kitchen before the plate reached the table. Kilt lettuce, sometimes called killed lettuce, was the Appalachian way of turning raw leaf lettuce into something warm and wilted and dressed all at once. You picked the lettuce fresh from the garden, leaf lettuce, never iceberg, piled it in a bowl, and poured a hot dressing of bacon grease, apple cider vinegar, and a pinch of sugar directly over the raw leaves. The heat wilted them instantly, and you ate it before it cooled, because kilt lettuce that sat too long turned limp and sad. The window between too small and too bitter lasted only a few weeks. You didn't need a calendar. The lettuce told you when it was ready. A shirt lasted until it could not be patched anymore. And even then, the good fabric got cut into quilt squares or cleaning rags before anything went to waste. Your mother kept a sewing basket by the chair where she sat in the evenings. Needles, thread in 6 colors, a pincushion shaped like a tomato, and a collection of buttons saved from every garment that had finally worn through. Patches went over patches. Knees on overalls got reinforced with scraps from a flour sack. Elbows on work shirts were darned so many times the thread built up into a kind of armor. Nobody called it sustainable fashion. Nobody photographed it for a lifestyle blog. It was just what you did when buying new was not an option, and the next paycheck was not guaranteed. Now, visible mending is a movement. Workshops charge $200 to teach Japanese boro stitching techniques that Appalachian women had been practicing under a different name since before their grandmothers were born. The stitch was the same, only the price of learning it changed. Seasoning a cast iron skillet with nothing but lard and daily use was how every pan in those kitchens got its black glass smooth finish, and it took years, not hours. You rubbed the pan with lard or bacon grease after every washing, set it back on the warm stove to dry, and cooked in it again the next morning. The fat polymerized into a hard, slick coating that nothing stuck to, and every meal added another layer. Griswold and Wagner pans from the 1920s were cast thinner and machined smoother than anything made today, and the women who cooked on them built seasoning so deep you could fry an egg and slide it onto a plate without a spatula. People now buy pre-seasoned skillets and wonder why the eggs still stick. The answer is 60 years of daily use that nobody can rush. That pan worked because she used it every day of her life, and when she was gone, the seasoning held more of her than any photograph. Sourdough starter maintenance was a responsibility passed down through generations, with some families keeping the same living culture alive for decades. Grandma fed her starter daily with flour and water, keeping it warm near the wood stove where temperatures stayed consistent. The wild yeasts living in that bubbly mixture provided leavening for bread, biscuits, and pancakes without store-bought yeast. A healthy starter smelled pleasantly sour and doubled in size within hours of feeding. Grandma knew her starter's moods, adjusting schedules and temperatures based on how it looked and smelled. Before long trips, starter was dried on cloth or shared with neighbors for safekeeping. New brides often received a portion of their mother's starter as a wedding gift, carrying tradition into new households. The starter connected generations through a living organism that had nourished ancestors and would feed descendants. Losing a starter through neglect was considered a minor tragedy in households that valued continuity. Wrapping meat in corn husks before roasting was a preservation and cooking technique that kept moisture locked in while adding subtle sweetness to the finished dish. Fresh or dried corn husks were soaked until pliable, then wrapped tightly around seasoned cuts of pork, game, or poultry before being buried in coals or placed in Dutch ovens. The husks protected meat from direct heat while trapping steam inside, essentially creating a natural cooking pouch that basted the meat in its own juices. The corn imparted a faint sweetness that complemented pork especially well, creating flavor that seemed fancier than the simple method suggested. Families saved husks from corn season specifically for this purpose, drying them in bundles that hung from rafters until needed. The technique required no special equipment and produced consistently tender results. This method connected cooking to the harvest cycle, using every part of what the land provided. Egg carton. Fire starters turned kitchen waste into reliable kindling that could ignite reluctant firewood on cold mornings. Families saved cardboard egg cartons throughout the year, filling each cup with dryer lint, sawdust, or small wood shavings. Melted candle wax or bacon grease was poured over the mixture, creating compact fire-starting pods that burned hot and long enough to catch larger wood. Each carton yielded a dozen individual starters that could be stored indefinitely in dry locations. The hack solved the perpetual challenge of starting fires in wood stoves and fireplaces, especially during damp weather when kindling refused to catch. One pod placed beneath arranged firewood could have flames roaring within minutes, eliminating the frustration of failed fire attempts. Mountain families kept supplies of these starters ready throughout winter months, knowing reliable heat was essential to survival. Planting a fall garden for winter greens extended the growing season and provided fresh vegetables when most families relied entirely on preserved foods and whatever stores offered. Collards, kale, turnips, and winter lettuce actually improved with light frost, becoming sweeter as cold converted their starches to sugars. These hardy greens survived well into winter under simple cold frames or even just mulch protection in milder areas. A fall garden required minimal effort since cooler weather meant less watering and fewer pest problems than summer growing. Families who planted in late summer harvested fresh greens through Thanksgiving and beyond, adding nutrition and variety to winter diets. The practice cost nothing beyond seeds and contradicted the assumption that gardening ended with first frost. Children saw that food production could happen year-round with planning and knowledge. Fresh winter greens tasted like small miracles after months of canned and dried provisions. Number 18. Baking cornbread in an iron skillet with 3 ingredients. The Black Lodge skillet pulled from the oven smelled like dark honey and a wood fire all at once. One thing I rarely see modern recipes get right about cornbread is the preheat. The skillet had to be smoking before the batter went in, with a slick of grease coating the bottom, or the bread stuck and the crust never set. She shook yellow cornmeal into a bowl, added salt, and mixed in enough buttermilk and a spoon of bacon fat to make a thick batter. 22 minutes in a 400-degree oven. The crust came out crisp around the edges and tender in the middle. The recipe is still the recipe. 3 things and a hot oven. Number 15. Lye soap for cutting grease off iron skillets. Jewel made lye soap once a year, the first week after hog killing in December 1955. She poured rainwater through a barrel of hickory ash to draw off the lye, then stirred the lye into a kettle of rendered hog fat over a slow fire until it traced. She poured it into a wooden trough and cut it into bars after 2 days. That soap was not pretty. It was tan, rough, and it smelled like the barnyard. A sliver of it, rubbed on a greasy wash rag, cut grease off the floor, the table, the children's knees, and the black iron cookpots in one pass. She never used it on the seasoned skillet. Lye soap would have stripped the black right off. She kept it for the plain iron and the kitchen floor. The hog gave her a year's worth of soap in one afternoon. A bar of ivory at the store cost 10 cents in 1955. Jewel made 40 bars from one hog. Your great-grandmother did not buy soap for decades. Number 15. Ramp and potato hash. In April, when the ramps came up in the hollows of Randolph County, West Virginia, a hillbilly cook would walk the ridge with a burlap sack and come home with a pound of green leaves and white bulbs that smelled like onion and garlic hit with a hammer. She diced the ramps fine, tossed them into a skillet with cubed potatoes and a spoonful of bacon grease, and cooked the whole pan for 11 minutes. You could smell it from 3 houses down. Ramp and potato hash was a free meal because the ramps cost nothing and the potatoes were a nickel a pound. It was the taste of spring in a coal camp, and for many families it was the first hot green meal after a long winter of dried beans and canned tomatoes. Number 15. Vienna sausages and crackers. A small can of Armor Star. Vienna sausages cost about 15 cents in 1961. A box of saltine crackers cost a quarter and lasted a week. Together, they were the universal snack of every country store and coal camp commissary in Appalachia. You opened the can with the key soldered to the bottom, peeled back the lid, and fished out the little sausages with your fingers or a pocket knife. They were soft, pink, and packed in a salty broth. You put one on a cracker and ate it in 2 bites. Nobody pretended they were good. Nobody claimed they tasted like real sausage. But they were cheap, available, and required no cooking, no refrigeration, and no cleanup. In the hollows of Appalachia, where the nearest hot meal might be hours away, that was enough. In August, when the pole bean crop came in faster than any one family could handle, the neighbors came. Chairs went out on the porch, wash pans filled with freshly pulled beans, and the work started. Break the tip, pull the string down the pod, snap the bean, drop it in. The sound was specific: a dry snap, a soft rustle, a hollow knock against the tin, hour after hour, set under conversation and children running in the yard. Bean stringing days were documented as community cooperative events across Appalachia as far back as the early 1900s. Women brought their best stories to bean stringing days. Some of those conversations are the last clear memory certain families hold of grandmothers now gone. Her voice, the smell of the beans, the weight of the pan. The beans went into jars or leather breeches or that night's supper. The day those hands made together was harder to put up. Nobody told you the rules of the clothesline. You absorbed them by watching long enough until the knowledge became your own. Whites went on the outside lines where the sun hit all morning. The unmentionables went in the middle, hidden behind the sheets where the road couldn't see them. You never hung a shirt by the shoulders, always by the tail or the shoulders stretched crooked. Never left clothespins on the line overnight. And never, under any roof in any county, hung wash on a Sunday. She kept those rules not because anyone was checking, but because the standard was the standard. The day they took her to the hospital, there was a full line of whites out. Her daughter brought them in dry, folded them without shaking, and put them in the drawer. They stayed there for years. A quart jar of home-canned tomatoes opened with a pop and poured into a saucepan. That sound meant supper was 10 minutes away. Stewed tomatoes over rice showed up on the table every week from July through February in households that canned their own garden surplus. You heated the tomatoes with a little salt, a spoonful of sugar to soften the acid, and sometimes a torn piece of stale bread to thicken things up. Then you spooned the whole mess over a plate of white rice. Through the 1950s and 60s, when a 25-pound bag of rice cost less than $1, this was one of the fastest, cheapest suppers a person living alone could make. One burner, one pot, one plate. The tomatoes tasted like August even in the dead of winter, bright, sweet, still carrying the warmth of the afternoon she spent standing over the canning pot. She kept the seeds in envelopes in a shoebox on the top shelf of the pantry, and every envelope had a name written in pencil: Half Runner, Turkey Craw, Greasy Cut Short, October Bean, names that never appeared in any catalog because they had been passed between neighbors and kin for so long that nobody remembered where they started. Saving seed was automatic. You let the best pods dry on the vine, shelled them out in October, and stored them somewhere cool and dark until spring. The varieties were adapted to that specific hillside, that specific altitude, that specific soil, refined by 100 growing seasons into something no commercial seed company could replicate. When the old gardeners died, the seeds often died with them, tossed out by children who did not know what was inside those envelopes. Chef Travis Milton now grows over 100 rare Appalachian varieties at his restaurant in Bristol, Virginia, collected from mountain old-timers before the last of them stopped planting. Every seed he saved is a voice that almost went silent. Knowing the grease was hot enough just by listening was a skill that took years to build and seconds to use. The old cooks did not look at the oil. They listened. Cold grease was silent. Warm grease whispered. Hot grease crackled and popped with a sharp, steady rhythm that said, "Drop the chicken now." Too hot, and the sound turned angry, spitting hard with a hiss that meant the fat was breaking down and the food would burn before it cooked through. They could tell the difference between 350 degrees and 400 without ever glancing at a dial, because they had stood at that stove so many thousands of times that the sound was as readable as a familiar voice. It was knowledge built into the body, not the brain, something earned through 10,000 suppers and never written in a single cookbook. The woman who could read the grease never had to guess, and nobody who came after her could hear what she heard. Herb drying and storage was essential knowledge that transformed summer gardens into year-round flavor sources. Grandma harvested sage, thyme, rosemary, and dill at their peak, cutting stems in the morning after dew evaporated, but before afternoon sun wilted leaves. Small bundles were tied with string and hung upside down from kitchen rafters where warm air circulated freely. Over weeks, the herbs dried slowly, concentrating essential oils into potent seasonings that lasted through winter. Once completely dry, leaves were stripped and stored in small jars away from light and moisture. A pinch of dried sage transformed bland pork, while dried mint made winter teas feel medicinal and warming. Some grandmas crushed herbs into powder, others kept leaves whole for controlled seasoning. The hanging bundles became kitchen decorations, their fragrance filling the air with reminders of summer abundance even during the coldest months when gardens lay buried under snow. Burying cabbages for winter was the root cellar technique that kept this cruciferous vegetable fresh for months without any processing or canning. Whole heads were pulled from the garden with roots attached, then buried upside down in trenches lined with straw, with only the roots exposed above ground. The earth's stable temperature prevented freezing while the straw provided insulation and drainage. Families dug up heads as needed through winter, brushing off dirt to reveal crisp leaves that tasted nearly as fresh as harvest day. The technique required dry soil and good drainage to prevent rot, so placement was chosen carefully. This method stored vegetables using nothing but the ground itself, requiring no jars, salt, or special equipment. Children were sent to dig up cabbages for Sunday dinner, learning where each head was buried. This ancient preservation method kept families supplied with fresh vegetables through the coldest months. Walnut shell dye created rich brown coloring for fabric, Easter eggs, and craft projects using nothing but discarded nutshells and water. Families collected black walnut shells throughout autumn, knowing the dark hulls contained powerful natural pigments. The shells were boiled in water for hours, producing a deep brown liquid that could permanently stain natural fibers and porous materials. Fabric soaked in the dye emerged transformed, colored in shades ranging from tan to nearly black, depending on concentration and soaking time. The same dye worked beautifully on Easter eggs, creating earthy tones that contrasted with commercial pastel colors. Children helped gather shells and watch the magic of color extraction, learning early that nature provided solutions for creative needs. The dye was color-fast and required no chemical mordants for cotton and wool, making it completely free and entirely natural. Cleaning fields after commercial harvest provided free produce that farmers left behind because picking wasn't worth their labor costs, but was certainly worth family effort. After crops were commercially harvested, families walked fields gathering potatoes, corn, beans, and other vegetables that mechanical harvesters missed or damaged. Farmers generally welcomed gleaners who cleaned their fields while getting free food, creating relationships that benefited everyone involved. A day of gleaning could yield bushels of produce that would cost significant money at stores, all free for the labor of bending and gathering. Children participated alongside adults, learning that food existed beyond grocery stores for those willing to work. The practice taught humility and gratitude while filling pantries and root cellars with provisions. Gleaning connected families to agricultural cycles and farming neighbors in ways that buying at stores never could, building community while building food security. Number 23. Saving bacon grease in a tin can next to the stove. Saving every drop of bacon grease was the single most reliable trick in any hillbilly kitchen. She kept a Hills Brothers coffee can on the rear burner with cheesecloth over the top. Every morning, she poured the hot grease slowly through the cloth into the can. By Saturday, she had a half pint of clear amber fat that she used to fry cornbread, sear green beans, slick the biscuit pan, and start the milk gravy. 1 pound of bacon at the company store in 1964 ran 59 cents, and the grease was the cooking oil for the rest of the week. But she never bought lard, and she never bought shortening. The grease can never went empty because she never let it, and the woman who tended it that carefully made the rest of the kitchen budget stretch the same way. The Hills Brothers can held grease from Oscar Mayer bacon strips. Today, bacon costs around $6 a pound, and a bottle of vegetable oil costs almost $5. The same trick still cuts your kitchen budget in half. Number 14. Eggshells dropped into the coffee pot. Jewel drank her coffee strong and clear. She used a blue enamel percolator on the cook stove, coarse ground Louisiane that cost 31 cents a pound, and a trick her grandmother had taught her back in 1910. After she scooped the grounds into the basket, she crushed one clean eggshell in her fist and tossed it on top of the grounds. The albumin in the shell bound the grounds together and pulled them to the bottom of the pot. The alkaline calcium carbonate cut the bitter edge off the acid. The coffee came out smooth and amber, not muddy. An egg a week was a cheap price for clear coffee. This was a working trick every cattle drive cook in the West used in the 1880s. The mountain women had it too, and they used it without knowing it was famous. The shell went in the scrap bucket and fed the chickens. Your grandmother's coffee may have tasted better than yours for this reason. Number 17. Jiffy Cornmeal Mush. Jiffy Corn Muffin Mix cost 9 cents a box at the Williamson A&P in 1972. But hillbilly women did not always bake the muffins. They stirred the mix into a pot of boiling salted water, let it thicken for 5 minutes, and poured the hot mush into a loaf pan to set. The next morning, you sliced the firm mush into half-inch slabs, fried them in bacon grease until the outside was crisp and gold, and served them with sorghum syrup or a pat of butter. Breakfast cost under a dime per person. Women in Mingo County fed their children this before the school bus came, and the meal stuck to a coal miner's ribs until lunch. One box made 8 servings. A bottle of sorghum molasses was 65 cents and lasted a month. Nothing about it was fancy. Everything about it worked. Number 16. Poke Salad. In April, when the first green shoots pushed through the forest floor, families went out to pick poke. The young leaves of the pokeweed plant were free food, growing wild along fence rows and creek banks. Pokeweed is toxic, though. The mature leaves and berries contain compounds that can make a person seriously ill. The trick was to pick only the youngest shoots, no more than 6 inches tall, and boil them in 3 changes of water to draw out the toxins. After the third boiling, the greens were safe. People ate them fried in bacon grease with a little salt, sometimes with a fried egg on top. In the coal camps of eastern Kentucky, poke salad was the first fresh green food people ate after a long winter of canned goods and dried beans. It tasted like spring. It tasted like the end of something hard and the beginning of something easier. They called them dry land fish or hickory chickens, depending on which hollow you came from. And the name told you how they were eaten. Cut the morel in half, soak it in salt water to chase out whatever was living inside, dust it in cornmeal, and fry it in bacon grease until crisp and golden and smelling of the woods and the skillet at the same time. Morels appeared for 2 to 3 weeks each spring in the hardwood forests of Appalachia, and the people who found them were not going to tell you where their patch was. Ever. Finding morels required knowing which trees they grew near, what the soil smelled like when conditions were right, and how to tell a true morel from a false morel, which was toxic enough to make the uninformed wish they had asked. Grandmothers guarded their spots the way some people guard money. Some patches stayed in families for 4 generations. The locations are still not shared with people who need to be told what to look for. Before the stain set, she was already reaching for the yellow bar. Fell's Naphtha soap had been sold in American grocery stores since the 1880s, and by the 1930s it was on the shelf of nearly every Appalachian laundry porch, not because anyone advertised it to mountain families, but because it worked when nothing else came close. The trick was to get it wet and work it in while the fabric was still damp, rubbing the bar directly into the grass stain or the grease spot in tight circles until the fabric warmed from friction and the stain started lifting. Children ran in from the field trailing red clay and muddy knees, and she didn't reach for a bucket. She reached for the bar. A single bar cost about 9 cents in the 1940s. You can still find it today on the bottom shelf of the laundry aisle, wrapped in the same yellow paper, doing the same work. Most people walk right past it. Leftover pintos never went to waste in a mountain kitchen, not when you could mash them, shape them into patties, and fry them in a hot skillet until the outside turned crisp and the inside stayed soft and warm. Bean cakes were the second life of a pot of soup beans, made the day after the original meal when the beans had thickened overnight in the refrigerator or on the back of the stove. You mashed them with a fork, mixed in a handful of cornmeal or flour to hold them together, and fried them flat in bacon grease. During the Depression, when a 12-cent bag of dried pintos could feed a family for 3 days, bean cakes extended that to 4. The first day was soup beans with cornbread. The second day was bean cakes fried for supper. Nothing wasted, nothing thrown out, Every calorie pulled from that single bag of dried beans. The cornmeal crust gave them a crunch the original beans never had, and that crunch made it feel like a different meal entirely. A pot of soup beans cost almost nothing and fed a family for 3 days. Dried pintos soaked overnight, then simmered all morning with a ham hock or a chunk of salt pork, an onion cut in half, and enough water to keep the beans covered while they cooked down thick and creamy. The ham hock was not a flavor choice. It was the cheapest piece of pork at the store, sometimes 5 cents a pound, and it gave the broth a smoky depth that turned plain beans into a meal worth sitting down for. You ate them over cornbread with raw onion on the side and a glass of buttermilk, and that was supper. Nobody apologized for it. The pot stayed on the stove, and every day the beans tasted better as the liquid thickened and the pork fell apart into the broth. Now one-pot cooking is a wellness philosophy. Your mother could have told them everything they needed to know before the water boiled. Pinning a slice of bread to the cut side of a cake with toothpicks to keep it moist was the kind of trick that made you laugh until you tried it and watched it work. When you sliced into a cake and left the exposed crumb open to air, moisture evaporated fast and the edges turned dry and crumbly by the next morning. But a piece of white bread pressed flat against the cut surface with 2 toothpicks acted like a seal. The bread dried out instead of the cake, sacrificing itself so the good part stayed soft. You peeled the stale bread off the next day, and the cake underneath was as fresh as the hour it came out of the oven. This trick showed up at church socials and county fairs across Appalachia, wherever a woman needed a cake to last through a long afternoon of serving. It cost 1 slice of bread and solved a problem that aluminum foil and plastic wrap never quite fixed. Water glass egg preservation allowed mountain families to store fresh eggs for months without refrigeration, ensuring protein through winter when hens stopped laying. Grandma dissolved sodium silicate in water to create a thick gel-like solution in large crocks. Fresh eggs, gathered the same day and never washed to preserve their natural coating, were gently lowered into the mixture until submerged. The solution sealed porous shells, preventing air and bacteria from entering while keeping moisture inside. Properly stored eggs lasted 6 months or longer in cool root cellars, tasting nearly as fresh as when laid. Families packed dozens of eggs in late summer when hens produced abundantly, creating reserves for winter baking. The practice required careful selection. Only perfect, uncracked eggs would keep. Children learned to handle eggs gently, understanding each one represented future meals. When refrigeration arrived, water glass faded from kitchens, taking with it generations of preservation knowledge. Cooking in clay pots buried in coals was slow roasting that required no attention once the pot was sealed and covered. Unglazed clay pots were filled with meat, vegetables, and liquid, then covered tightly and buried completely in the hot ashes of a dying fire. The clay absorbed and distributed heat evenly, while the tight seal trapped moisture inside, creating conditions similar to modern slow cookers. Families prepared these pots in the evening and left them buried overnight, waking to find tender stews ready for breakfast or midday meals. The technique freed women from tending fires constantly, allowing other work while dinner cooked itself. The clay imparted a subtle earthiness to foods that metal pots could not replicate. This method was especially valuable during harvest times when every available hand was needed in fields rather than kitchens. The pots themselves were often handmade from local clay. Butter wrapper greaser was a frugal technique that squeezed every bit of value from purchased butter by saving wrappers for greasing baking pans. Families carefully preserved the waxy paper wrappers after unwrapping butter sticks, folding them and storing them in kitchen drawers. When recipes called for greased pans, these saved wrappers provided enough residual butter to coat surfaces without using additional product. Children learned early to smooth wrappers flat rather than crumpling them, maximizing the usable surface area. The wrappers worked perfectly for cake pans, cookie sheets, and bread loaf tins, preventing sticking without any waste. Some families stored wrappers in the refrigerator to keep the butter residue fresh, while others kept them at room temperature for easier spreading. This simple habit saved measurable amounts of butter over time, stretching grocery budgets in households where every penny counted. Buying staples in bulk during sales reduced per-unit costs dramatically and ensured families never ran out of basics regardless of when the next paycheck arrived or sale occurred. Smart shoppers watched advertisements and stocked up on flour, sugar, cornmeal, and rice when prices dropped, buying months of supply at once. This required storage space and initial capital, but paid dividends through consistent savings that compounded over time. Families with well-stocked pantries never paid full price for staples because they could wait for sales rather than buying from necessity. The practice smoothed out price fluctuations and provided security against hard times when any grocery money became precious. Children grew up in homes where abundant pantry shelves represented not wealth, but wisdom and planning. Buying bulk during sales could reduce staple costs by 30% or more annually, savings that added up to meaningful money over years. Number 25. Stretching ground beef with oatmeal in the meatloaf pan. Stretching the meat was the simplest move in any hillbilly kitchen. A cup of rolled oats soaked in cold milk stretched a pound of chuck across 2 suppers. She mixed everything in a wooden bowl, packed it into a buttered pan, and baked it slow. What I didn't expect about a hillbilly meatloaf is that the milk soak does the work, not the meat itself. The oats need 10 minutes in the milk before the meat goes in, or the loaf falls apart cold the next morning. Number 13. Fried green tomatoes. In August, when the tomato vines in a backyard garden in Wise County, Virginia, dropped more fruit than a family could can, the green ones came off first. You sliced them a 1/4 inch thick, dredged them in cornmeal seasoned with salt and pepper, and fried them in bacon grease for 4 minutes aside. The outside was crunchy, the inside was tart, and a stack of 6 slices alongside a plate of soup beans made a dinner that felt like a celebration. A bushel of green tomatoes from your own garden cost nothing. The cornmeal was 4 cents per serving. It was the kind of meal that showed up on a kitchen table in the same week a coal company announced a layoff and nobody felt poor eating it. Rendering lard was a whole-day affair that happened once a year after the November hog killing, when the fat back and leaf lard were cut away in thick slabs and set to melt in the biggest cast-iron pot over a low wood fire outside. You stirred with a long paddle to keep the fat from scorching, watching the solid white chunks shrink and liquefy over several hours until only the cracklings were left. Small, brown, crispy pieces of skin floating in clear golden fat. The lard got ladled into crocks while it was still liquid and hardened white and smooth by morning. Leaf lard, the fat from around the kidneys, was considered the finest grade, mild enough for pie crust and biscuits without adding a heavy pork flavor. A well-rendered crock kept most of a year in a cool pantry. The cracklings left behind were salted and eaten warm, or saved for crackling cornbread. Nothing in the rendering process was wasted. Not a drop. Tilting it until she could see the color shift. Getting it wrong once was enough to learn it forever. Before chlorine bleach was widely available, the sun did the work. Spreading wet white linens on clean grass in full morning sunlight was a bleaching method Appalachian and rural Southern households used continuously from the colonial period into the 1940s, and in isolated mountain communities beyond. The science is simple. Sunlight activates oxygen in the moisture held in the fabric, and that oxygen breaks down the compounds responsible for yellowing. Grass adds trace acids from dew that assist the process. The combination was gentle enough that it could be repeated weekly without weakening the fibers the way chlorine treatments did over time. You laid the sheets flat, overlapping nothing, and left them until they dried almost completely, then brought them in still slightly damp for ironing. Heavy, dew-covered grass worked better than dry. A cloudy day was wasted effort. She knew the difference between a sun worth using and one that was only decorating the sky, and she planned wash day around it the way a farmer planned planting. Peanut butter mixed with Caro corn syrup, stirred together in a bowl until it turned into a thick, glossy spread, was supper for mountain kids from the 1930s straight through the 1970s. You spread it on whatever bread was left in the house, or if bread was gone, you ate it straight off a spoon. The combination worked because the corn syrup cut the thickness of the peanut butter and stretched it twice as far, and together they delivered enough fat, sugar, and protein to keep a child standing. A jar of Caro cost pennies. peanut butter was one of the cheapest proteins on the shelf. Mixed together, they made something sweet enough that kids didn't realize they were eating a desperation meal. You remember the taste exactly. You remember the spoon. You remember her setting it down without a word. Sorghum was an all-day production that smelled sweet enough to pull you off the road. The cane stalks were stripped by hand, fed through a horse-drawn press that squeezed the juice out in a thin green stream, and that juice was boiled down in a long, shallow copper pan over a wood fire, stirred constantly for hours while the water evaporated and the liquid turned from pale green to deep amber. One misstep with the heat and the whole batch scorched. The person stirring had to know the color, the way the bubbles changed shape, the exact moment to pull the pan. Sorghum was the only sweetener most mountain families could afford. White sugar was a store-bought luxury. A gallon poured over hot biscuits with butter could make a cold morning feel like a holiday. That same gallon now costs $25 at a specialty food shop, bottled with a label that says artisan on it, as if the word adds something the sorghum does not already have. She cut it off the cob with a sharp knife held at an angle, then scraped the back of the blade down each bare cob to get the milk out. That was the part most people skipped, and the part that made all the difference. Frying corn fresh off the cob in bacon grease was a late summer ritual in mountain kitchens, and it tasted nothing like boiled corn on the cob or anything from a can. The kernels hit the hot skillet and the natural sugars caramelized against the iron, while the starchy corn milk thickened into a creamy sauce that coated everything. Some cooks added a dusting of flour and a splash of milk to stretch it, turning it into what the old folks called cream corn, though it had nothing to do with the canned version. It was a dish that only existed for a few weeks every August when the field corn came in, and the women who made it right never did it the same way twice. They went by the look of the kernels and the sound of the skillet, and when they were gone, that particular August taste went with them. Butter churning was weekly labor that transformed cream skimmed from daily milk into the golden fat essential for baking and cooking. Grandma collected cream in crocks throughout the week, letting it ripen slightly in cool temperatures until enough accumulated for churning. The cream was poured into a wooden dasher churn or ceramic crock, and then came the rhythmic work, plunging the dasher up and down for what seemed like hours until the fat separated from buttermilk. Children often took turns at the churn, their small arms tiring before the butter finally came together in golden clumps floating in thin liquid. The butter was gathered, washed repeatedly in cold water to remove all buttermilk, then worked with wooden paddles to press out remaining moisture. Salt was kneaded in for preservation, and the butter was packed into molds or crocks for storage. The leftover buttermilk became valuable for baking. Homemade butter tasted richer and more complex than store-bought, its flavor reflecting what the cows had been eating. Smoking meat in the chimney was how mountain families preserved pork, game, and fish, using smoke from fires they were already burning for warmth and cooking. Hooks or racks installed inside chimneys held meat in the rising smoke stream, which dried and flavored the flesh while depositing preservative compounds that prevented spoilage. The technique required careful attention because too much heat cooked the meat while too little failed to preserve it, so families positioned racks at exactly the right height. Different woods produced different flavors, with hickory and apple being prized while pine was avoided for its resinous taste. The process took days or weeks depending on the size of cuts, with someone checking regularly to ensure even smoking. Meat preserved this way lasted through entire winters without refrigeration, providing essential protein. The chimney served double duty, heating the home while preparing food for storage throughout the winter months. Bread bag boot covers were improvised waterproofing that kept feet dry during wet weather when proper rain boots were unavailable or worn through. Families saved the plastic bags that store-bought bread came in, recognizing their potential as emergency foot protection. The bags were pulled over socks before feet went into shoes or boots, creating a moisture barrier that prevented water from reaching skin. Children walked to school through puddles and mud with dry feet, protected by nothing more than yesterday's bread wrapper. The bags were thin enough to fit inside regular footwear without discomfort, yet sturdy enough to survive a day's wear before tearing. Parents taught this trick to children as essential survival knowledge, understanding that wet feet in cold weather could lead to serious illness. The hack cost nothing and worked remarkably well, proving that protective gear didn't require store purchases. Making apple butter from windfall fruit transformed free-fallen apples that would otherwise rot into preserved sweetness that lasted through winter and spread across countless breakfasts. Families gathered apples that dropped naturally or were knocked down by storms. Fruit, too bruised for fresh eating but perfectly good for cooking. These apples were quartered, cooked down with water until soft, then strained and simmered for hours with sugar and spices until thick and dark. The slow cooking required attention and stirring, but no special skills or equipment beyond a large pot and wooden spoon. Sealed in jars, apple butter kept for years and provided natural sweetness for biscuits, toast, pancakes, and oatmeal. Children helped gather apples and stir the pot, learning patience while the kitchen filled with cinnamon fragrance. This practice turned potential waste into valuable preserved food that would cost significant money at any store. Number 12. Boiling chicken feet for the gelatin in the broth. She said the feet were the secret to the soup. Your grandmother bought a pound of yellow chicken feet at the meat counter in 1965 for 11 cents, blanched them 30 seconds in boiling water, peeled the tough outer skin off under cold running water, and slid the cleaned feet into a stock pot of cold water with an onion, a carrot top, and black pepper. 6 hours at a low simmer at the rear of the cook stove. The broth turned a deep color of dark tea, thick enough to coat a spoon and hold the spoon in the bowl when you set it down. She used the broth as the base for chicken and dumplings, the simmer water for the rice, the stock for the soup beans, and the wash for the cornbread skillet on Sunday morning. 1 pound of feet stretched into 6 full pots of cooking through the week. Today, a pound of chicken feet still costs you under $2, and a quart of bone broth at the grocery runs nearly $9. The gelatin was the secret. The patience was the recipe. Sorghum making was a community event that happened once a year in early fall, when the tall cane was cut and hauled to whichever neighbor had the mill. A horse walked slow circles, turning the press that squeezed the pale green juice from the cane stalks, and the juice ran off into a long, flat, evaporating pan set over a low fire, tended by the most experienced cook in the group, the one who knew how to skim the rising green foam and who read the color shift from pale yellow through amber to the deep dark brown that meant the sorghum was done. Too early and the syrup fermented in the jar. Too late and it burned bitter. The whole community brought their cane and shared the day's labor, and the sorghum got divided by how much cane each family had contributed. A gallon of good sorghum molasses sweetened a winter's worth of cornbread batter, gingerbread, and stack cake. The skill of reading the pan, knowing by color and smell when to pull it off, went with the last people who stood long enough at enough stir-offs to learn it. If the sun bleached the linens, the iron finished them. Testing the temperature of a flat iron before thermostats existed was a skill that lived in the hands and nowhere else. 2 irons rotated on the wood stove, one heating while the other was in use, so the work never stopped for a cold one. The test was not a thermometer. You held the iron 3 or 4 inches from the inside of your wrist, gauging the heat radiating off the metal without touching it. Too hot for the wrist meant too hot for linen. A strip of brown paper on the ironing board gave a second read. If the iron scorched it brown, it was ready for heavy cotton. If it scorched it black in under 2 seconds, you set it back on the stove. This rotation, 2 irons, 1 surface, hands that knew the difference, was the system in Appalachian households from the 1920s through the 1950s. Her granddaughter, who grew up with a dial iron, burned every collar she touched the first summer she tried. No 2 jars of chow chow ever tasted the same, and that was exactly the point. Chow chow was Appalachia's answer to the end-of-season garden glut. Whatever vegetables were left got chopped, pickled in vinegar with brown sugar and spices, and sealed in mason jars for the winter. Cabbage, green tomatoes, onions, bell peppers, hot peppers, sometimes corn or green beans. Every jar reflected what that particular garden had produced that particular year. You spooned it cold over soup beans, fried potatoes, cornbread, or anything that needed a sharp, tangy bite to cut through the richness. Through the 1940s and 50s, A shelf of chow chow jars in the cellar meant a family had planned ahead, and running out before spring was a failure nobody discussed. The recipe passed from mother to daughter without ever being written down, adjusted by taste and color and the smell of vinegar hitting a hot pot. Each woman's chow chow was as distinct as her handwriting, and when she stopped making it, no one could get it right. Keeping a slice of bread in the brown sugar jar was one of those small kitchen tricks that sounded like nonsense until you tried it. Brown sugar hardens because the molasses coating on each crystal loses moisture to the air, and the crystals fuse together into a brick you cannot scoop. A slice of plain white bread tucked into the jar released just enough moisture to keep the molasses soft without making anything wet. You replaced the bread every week or so when it went stale, which meant it had done its job. Some families used a damp cloth instead, and others swore by marshmallows, but the bread trick was the cheapest and the most reliable. Nobody explained the science. You just saw your mother drop a heel of bread in the sugar, and 20 years later, you were doing the same thing in your own kitchen without thinking about it. Preserving pork in salt barrels was the method that kept families fed with meat through entire winters before refrigeration existed in rural communities. Fresh pork was cut into manageable pieces, rubbed thoroughly with coarse salt, and layered into wooden barrels with more salt packed between each layer. The salt drew moisture from the meat while creating conditions too hostile for bacteria to survive, essentially mummifying the pork in edible form. Families calculated exactly how much salt was needed based on barrel size and meat quantity, knowing too little meant spoilage while too much made meat inedible. The barrels were stored in cool cellars where temperatures stayed stable through winter months. Before cooking, pieces were soaked in fresh water to remove excess salt, a process that took hours or overnight depending on thickness. This ancient preservation method required significant salt investment but provided protein security that justified every penny spent on that precious mineral. Saving and replanting seeds from the best garden plants meant never buying seeds again while developing varieties perfectly adapted to local growing conditions over generations. Families selected seeds from their healthiest, most productive plants, drying and storing them for next year's garden. These saved seeds carried genetics refined through years of selection, often outperforming commercial varieties bred for shipping rather than taste or local adaptation. The practice required knowledge of which plants bred true and which would cross-pollinate, but this knowledge passed through families like any other essential skill. A well-maintained seed collection represented decades of genetic refinement worth far more than its negligible cost. Children learned to identify the best plants for seed saving, understanding that next year's garden depended on this year's careful selection. Seed saving embodied mountain self-sufficiency, proving that even the smallest inputs could be eliminated through knowledge and planning. The shells were so hard that a hammer usually sent them skittering before cracking them, and a nutcracker was a joke. So the old cooks let the black walnuts dry in the sun for a week until the outer green husk had blackened and shrunk, then drove over them with the car. Just backed the rear tire down a row of walnuts on concrete, slow, and the shells cracked just enough to get a pick into without crushing the meat inside. Black walnuts had a flavor more complex than any commercial walnut, deeper, almost tannic, with a richness that made every recipe it touched taste more like itself. Children in Appalachian communities earned pocket money through the 1940s and 50s by gathering fallen black walnuts, shelling them, and selling the meat at general stores for a few cents a pound. The stain from the husks turned your hands dark brown for a week, and nothing washed it off. She kept a jar of the shelled meat in the freezer door all winter for cookies and cakes that tasted like nowhere else on earth. When the jar ran out, it was just a jar. In the coal camps of West Virginia, potato soup meant something different than it did in town. There was no cream, no butter, no garnish. You peeled potatoes, 3 or 4 if you had them, cut them into rough chunks, dropped them in a pot of water with a chopped onion, and boiled them until the potatoes fell apart and thickened the broth on their own. Salt, black pepper, and that was it. Miners' wives through the 1930s and 40s stretched this into a 2-day meal by adding water and reheating it each evening. The soup got thinner every night, but it stayed warm, and warm mattered more than full when the house had no insulation and the fire burned low. She ladled it into the same chipped bowl every evening. After she passed, that bowl sat empty in the cabinet for years. Pressing a floured finger into bread dough to know if it had risen enough was one of the oldest tests in baking, and it could not be replaced by a timer or a thermometer or a recipe that said wait 90 minutes. You poked the dough gently, about half an inch deep, and watched. If it sprang back immediately, it needed more time. If it sprang back slowly and left a faint impression, it was ready. If the dent stayed and did not move at all, you had waited too long. That reading lived entirely in your fingertip, in the resistance of the gluten, the temperature of the surface, the slight tackiness that meant the yeast was still alive and working. No cookbook could teach it. You either stood next to someone who knew, or you never learned. Stretching coffee with chicory root made expensive imported beans last twice as long, while adding an earthy depth that many families came to prefer over straight coffee. Chicory roots were dug, roasted until dark, and ground to mix with regular coffee at ratios that stretched the precious beans. The practice originated from necessity during times when coffee was scarce or unaffordable, but continued because many genuinely liked the flavor. A pound of coffee mixed with chicory lasted twice as long, cutting caffeine expenses in half without eliminating the morning ritual families treasured. The chicory itself could be grown in gardens, or foraged from roadsides where the blue-flowered plants grew wild. Children who grew up drinking chicory coffee often found pure coffee thin and unsatisfying by comparison. This simple substitution saved money monthly while creating a distinctive regional taste that became cultural identity rather than poverty marker. Before the movie made them famous, fried green tomatoes were not a side dish, they were the whole supper. At the end of summer, when the first frost threatened and the vines still hung heavy with unripe fruit, you picked every green tomato in the garden and brought them inside. Sliced thick, dredged through cornmeal with salt and pepper, and fried in a skillet of hot grease until both sides turned golden brown and the centers softened into something tangy and warm. That was a Tuesday night meal across the Appalachian South. Some cooks made a quick white gravy in the same skillet afterward, scraping up the cornmeal bits and stirring in milk, then pouring it over the fried tomatoes like a sauce. The green ones had a tartness that the ripe ones couldn't match, almost sour, and the cornmeal crust held a crunch that made every bite feel more substantial than it was. Nothing went to waste in that garden, not even the ones that never had time to turn red. Parching coffee beans in a cast-iron skillet over a wood fire was how mountain families roasted their own coffee long before anyone had heard of a French press or a pour-over. You bought green coffee beans in bulk. They were cheaper unroasted and kept longer in a cloth sack, and poured a single layer into a dry, heavy skillet set over medium heat. Then you stirred constantly with a wooden spoon for 20 to 30 minutes, never stopping, because the moment you walked away, the beans scorched and the batch was ruined. The kitchen filled with a smell so thick and warm it stayed in the walls. First crack came when the moisture escaped and the beans popped like quiet corn, and you pulled them off the heat when the color hit the shade of brown you wanted. The Foxfire books documented families in the southern Appalachian Mountains still parching coffee this way into the 1960s, and the ones who did it said store-roasted beans never tasted right after you had done it yourself. The skillet, the fire, the wooden spoon, every one of those tricks came down to the same thing in the end, which was knowing by feel what no instrument could tell you. Making vinegar from apple scraps turned kitchen waste into valuable preserving acid and salad dressing base that would otherwise require store purchase. Apple peels and cores were covered with water in crocks, left to ferment for weeks until alcohol formed, then exposed to air until bacteria converted the alcohol to acetic acid. The resulting vinegar worked perfectly for pickling, salad dressings, cleaning, and any other use requiring acid. Families who made their own vinegar never bought it from stores, saving money while using scraps that would otherwise become compost at best. The fermentation process required patience but no special equipment beyond a crock and cheesecloth cover. Children watched the transformation with fascination, learning that even garbage held potential value. Homemade vinegar often tasted more complex than commercial versions, with apple undertones that enhanced pickles and dressings. This practice exemplified the mountain philosophy that nothing should be wasted when transformation was possible. Using the color and smell of a dish as your only timer was not a shortcut. It was the original method, and it was more accurate than any clock. Those women knew cornbread was done when the edges pulled just slightly from the skillet and the top turned the color of a wheat field in September. They knew the beans were right when the kitchen smelled like ham and salt and the broth had gone from thin to heavy. They knew the pie was finished when the crust reached a shade of gold that no recipe could describe in words, darker than straw, lighter than honey, and glossy from the egg wash they brushed on by hand. Every dish had its own signal, and the women who cooked them every day read those signals the way a musician reads a room. They did not set a timer because they did not need one. Their whole body was a timer, eyes, nose, ears, all running at once. That kind of knowing takes a lifetime to build. It cannot be downloaded. Walk into any old hollow before dawn, and you can smell the cure rising from a smokehouse filled in November. The salt pork barrel under the porch. The jar of wood ash lie on the back shelf. The pinch of saltpeter folded into a Christmas ham and never named out loud. The labs in Ithaca are catching up to a woman in Letcher County who learned this from her mother in 1923. She did not write it down. She did not have to. The ham on the rafter was the proof, and the hollow that ate from it without losing a child to bad meat was the second proof. The laboratory that took 80 years to agree showed up as the witness, not the judge.